If you lived in a medieval castle, you might imagine your day beginning with the glorious sound of church bells, or maybe the distant honking of a goose with emotional problems. But for the porter, the castle's full-time, underpaid, over-alert guardian, morning began with something far more serious, deciding whether strangers were trustworthy, if they looked like the type who'd steal the silverware and blame it on bandits. The porter was the castle's first line of defence, its customer service representative, its suspicious bouncer, and its unofficial judge of human vibes. If you showed up at a castle unannounced, this was the man your entire fate depended on, which is unfortunate, because porters were famously difficult to impress. His job officially began at the Gatehouse, but Gatehouse is misleading. It wasn't a nice little booth with a window and a stool. It was a thick stone tunnel engineered to make visitors feel intimidated, claustrophobic, and mildly concerned about their life choices. The porter stationed himself there like a human gargoyle with a clipboard. He controlled the drawbridge, meaning he decided who got to enter, who had to wait, and who was staying outside long enough to reconsider their intentions. He wasn't just opening doors. He was managing the castle's literal lifeline. Open the gate for the wrong person, and congratulations. You've just invited 200 angry raiders to ruin everyone's week. Because of this, porters developed a unique talent: professional suspicion. They could tell the difference between a harmless peddler and a potential threat the same way modern airport security claims that you can tell the difference between a harmless traveller and someone who definitely packed something questionable. And just like airport security, the porter had two moods: bored and deeply aggressively skeptical. Hello travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The porter didn't simply who are you? No, he asked questions, lots of questions. Where did you come from? What village? Who do you know? Why is your cloak that colour? Where did you get that horse? Why is the horse looking at him funny? Do you know the Lord? Do you know the Lord's cousin? Do you know anyone who knows anyone who's ever heard of anyone who met the Lord? By question 7, most travellers were sweating more than the castle's cooks on feast day, and travellers couldn't just stroll across the drawbridge. Whether it was down, halfway raised, squeaking, or purposefully inconvenient depended entirely on the porter's mood. If you annoyed him, by being suspicious or boring or breathing too confidently, you'd find yourself waiting while he checked something in the records, which was medieval code for eating a snack while pretending to be busy. Inside the gatehouse, the porter kept a logbook, which was not so much an organised system as it was a collection of notes written with the enthusiasm of a tired schoolteacher. He recorded who entered, who left, who owed money, and who tried to bring in items they shouldn't, like forbidden weapons, suspicious parcels, or animals that were definitely not allowed inside the castle walls. There was always someone trying to smuggle a goose inside for reasons no historian will ever understand. But guarding the gate wasn't the porter's only task. Oh no. He also lived with the joy of managing deliveries. A castle received everything from food shipments to fabric rolls to weird gifts from neighbouring nobles, and all of it passed through him. Imagine having to inspect an incoming carts filled with barrels, sacks, hay bundles, livestock, weapons, tools, and the occasional surprise crate that twitched. The porter had to poke it, prod it, ask questions like, "Is this supposed to move?" and "Are you sure this isn't cursed?" before letting it in. When things got busy, the porter needed additional help, usually a young assistant whose primary job was opening and closing the smaller doors, wickets, inside the larger gate. These wicket doors were designed so people could pass through without opening the whole entrance, which saved time, protected against attack, and reduced the porter's chances of having to speak to yet another overly chatty merchant. The apprentice porter was essentially the medieval version of a trainee security guard, eager, confused, and frequently yelled at. The porter also handled visiting nobles, which was terrifying. If you messed up the etiquette, if you bowed too low, bowed too little, or bowed like you'd never bowed a day in your life, You risked offending someone powerful enough to write 3 angry letters about you. Noble guests always arrived with retinues, carts, horses, and expectations. The porter needed to know where to direct them, how to process their arrival, and, most importantly, how to smile politely while hoping they didn't try to take over the castle. Nobles loved doing that. Then there were emergencies. If there was danger, the porter was the one who slammed the gate shut, dropped the portcullis, raised the bridge, and prayed the hinges didn't betray him. Nobody thought about him until that moment, but when invaders came sprinting across the field, suddenly the porter became the most important man alive. The good news, he was essential. The bad news, essential jobs always came with stress, shouting, and a life expectancy that depended heavily on how quickly he could pull a rope. By the end of the day, after deciding the fate of dozens of visitors, managing traffic, checking goods, and surviving surprise inspections from his superiors, the porter retreated to his chamber, usually a tiny room near the gate so he could be woken at any hour for more urgent visitors. His room was small, cold, and smelled faintly of damp stone and regret. But it came with status. The porter wasn't rich, but he had authority. People needed his approval. He was in the end the man who decided how the world entered the castle. And tomorrow, he'd do it all again, armed with nothing but a keyring the size of a wagon wheel, a suspicious stare, and the patience of a medieval saint. If the porter was the suspicious guardian of the threshold, the watchmen were the castle's full-time anxiety department. The men tasked with staring into the distance until anything justified the hours spent fighting sleep. Their job was simple in theory, but wildly complicated in practice. Ensure nothing dangerous approached the castle. Unfortunately, danger in medieval times meant everything from a rival army to a single suspicious goat. The watchman's life was one long attempt to prevent disasters, while simultaneously avoiding the greatest medieval enemy of all, sheer mind-melting boredom. A castle's walls might look majestic to modern eyes, but to a watchman, they were simply his workplace, an endless stretch of stone walkway, the parapets, dotted with towers where he was stationed like a decorative piece of human furniture. His main job? Look at stuff. Look at the fields, the forests, the roads, the river, the sky, the suspiciously shaped bush, the traveller taking too long to tie his shoelaces, and occasionally look at his fellow watchman and mutter, "Do you see anything?" The answer, almost always, was no, and yet he had to keep looking, because the one time he blinked too long, an invading force would inevitably appear like a dramatic plot twist. Watchmen worked in shifts, climbing spiral staircases that felt like medieval gym workouts before treadmills existed. Once atop the walls, they paced slowly, eyes sharp and ears open. But human senses can only entertain themselves for so long before the brain starts offering alternative activities like humming, thinking about lunch, or briefly contemplating whether a cloud looks like a dragon or like a sheep with emotional issues. Still, the watchman had to resist the urge to daydream. One day of inattention, and the entire castle could find itself hosting unwelcome visitors with swords and questionable intentions. These men were trained not just to detect threats, but to interpret them, because medieval Europe had a deep love for ambiguous danger. A plume of dust in the distance, enemy army or farmer with enthusiasm issues. A group of riders approaching, friendly merchants or tax collectors, arguably more terrifying. A flicker of light in the forest at night, campfire or angry spirit with a grudge. The watchman had to decide quickly, because false alarms were embarrassing, but real alarms ignored meant disaster. Because of this, castles developed early warning systems, all managed by the watchman. The most iconic tool was the horn, a loud, unmistakable signal that something was happening. But the horn was sacred. You didn't blow it because you were cold, lonely, or mildly convinced you saw a wolf wearing an expression of political ambition. You blew it only when the situation required immediate attention. A horn blast could summon soldiers, alert civilians, wake up the law to start a defensive maneuver, or ruin everyone's peaceful afternoon nap. But horns weren't the only tools. Watchmen also rang bells, waved flags, lit beacon fires, or shouted instructions down to those below. Each method carried its own risks. Bells could freeze your fingers in winter. Flags required visibility, a problem when medieval weather decided to be dramatic. And shouting depended on both the strength of your lungs and the listening abilities of people below, who were often busy, loud, or conveniently ignoring the possibility of danger. Still, even the best tools couldn't protect watchmen from one enemy that threatened the castle more frequently than any army: night duty. Imagine standing on a cold stone wall at midnight, surrounded by wind, darkness, and the kind of silence that makes your imagination start listing every supernatural creature it has ever heard of. The moon might help, unless clouds decided to stage a takeover. Torches provided light, but also cast shadows that loved to dance menacingly. Every rustle became a potential threat. Every owl sounded like it was plotting something. And watchmen couldn't leave their posts. They patrolled back and forth, stamping their feet to stay warm, gripping their spears, and silently bargaining with the universe. If nothing attacks tonight, I promise to stop complaining about my boots, probably. Their only company might be another watchman several yards away, the two exchanging nods like co-workers acknowledging shared suffering. Yet the job wasn't all monotony and frostbite. There were moments of genuine tension, a mysterious figure lingering near the tree line, the distant sound of hoofbeats arriving too fast, a group of strangers whose clothing didn't match local fashions. In those moments, the watchman became the castle's first responder, shouting warnings and alerting the garrison. His quick judgment could mean the difference between preparing defences and panicking at the last second. Watchmen also guarded internal passages, stairways, gatehouse chambers, and certain restricted rooms when important guests visited. They served as hallway security, ceremonial escorts, and, on rare occasions, the ones tasked with politely telling someone they were not allowed near the Lord's personal wine supply, a dangerous mission depending on the person. The position came with a unique combination of responsibility and invisibility. If everything went well, nobody noticed the watchman at all, because a good watchman prevented problems before they happened. But if anything went wrong, the watchmen were the first to be questioned, criticised, or given deeply disappointed looks by people who definitely couldn't have done the job themselves. The good news, when danger appeared, they mattered immensely. The bad news, they mattered because they were standing between the castle and everyone who wanted to ruin its day. By sunrise, watchmen finally came off duty, aching, bleary-eyed, wind-battered, and convinced they had seen at least 3 ghosts, none confirmed. They descended the stairs to warm rooms and much-needed bread, because nothing fueled a medieval human alarm system like carbohydrates. And as they rested, another team took their place, ready to stare bravely and wearily into the endless horizon once more. If medieval castles had unsung heroes, true, noble, grievously underappreciated champions, they were not knights, nor lords, nor cooks, nor even witches who managed not to get accused of anything mysterious. No, the real heroes were the gong farmers, the men whose job was so essential and so horrifying that even historians whisper about them with sympathy. Their official duty, cleaning out the castle's latrines, cesspits, and garderobes, a task so deeply unpleasant that even medieval people, the masters of living with filth, preferred not to think about them too hard. Before we start, you must understand that a castle's waste disposal system was not the elegant, water-flushing marvel we enjoy today. Oh no, latrines were vertical shafts built into walls, leading downward toward pits or drainage channels. Garderobes were small, narrow toilet niches suspended over voids with openings so medieval people could let go of their earthly burdens, which then fell into a collection area below, a magical place filled with everything your imagination fears. That was where the gong farmers came in. The term gong originally meant going, as in what is going out of the body, a linguistic detail that tells you everything you need to know. A gong farmer in medieval terms was the sanitation worker whose job involved entering the pits, scooping out the waste, hauling it away, and praying that nothing unexpected lurked beneath the surface. And when I say unexpected, I mean anything from rotten food to lost jewellery to rats with ambitions. The cesspit was the castle's digestive system, and just like a digestive system, sometimes it kept things it shouldn't. People dropped coins, knives, trinkets, brooches, letters, and occasionally fabric that should not have been anywhere near a latrine. Gong farmers found it all. They didn't like looking too closely, but they also knew the golden rule. If the lord lost something valuable, it was probably in here. Now, cleaning the pits could not happen during the day. Why? Because the smell might have caused widespread emotional trauma. Gong farmers worked at night, when most people were asleep and therefore blissfully unaware of the horrors occurring beneath their feet. Their work shift started after sunset, when they climbed down ladders into the dark, airless pits armed with buckets, shovels, hooks, and a level of courage no knight could ever hope to match. Once inside, the gong farmer faced many challenges. First, breathing. Air inside a cesspit was not friendly. It was thick, moist, and filled with gases that made torches flicker and lungs reconsider their life goals. Second, stability. The ground was, let's say, inconsistent. Some areas were soggy, others were deceptive. A wrong step meant sinking, and while it wasn't quicksand, it was emotionally worse. Third, the rats, who lived in cesspits rent-free and with a sense of entitlement. Rats rarely appreciated being disturbed at 2 a.m, especially by men carrying buckets. Yet gong farmers persevered, scooping and hauling waste to be carted outside the castle walls. Their nightly trek out of the castle with full loads wasn't exactly glamorous. People hearing footsteps at midnight likely whispered, "Ghosts!" No, not ghosts, just sanitation. They dumped waste far outside the walls in designated fields, where the material would eventually be used as fertilizer, because medieval agriculture shared no shame and absolutely no boundaries. Surprisingly, gong farmers were paid better than many other castle servants, not because people respected them, but because nobody else wanted to do their job under any circumstances whatsoever. They received hazard pay before hazard pay had an official name. They earned decent wages, often earned exemptions from certain taxes, and sometimes even received lodging away from the general population, partly as a perk and partly because their clothes acquired a smell so persistent it could outlast winter. Their work was also dangerous. Inhaling fumes too long could make a man faint, fall into muck, and never be found. There were records of cesspit collapses, which we will not describe in detail out of respect for the recently nauseated. Even the tools they used could betray them. Ropes snapped, ladders slipped, and buckets broke at moments that felt personally insulting. But despite the danger, gong farmers developed pride in their craft. They understood what many others didn't. If they stopped working for even a few days, the castle would descend into a level of chaos only plagues and firestorms could rival. Waste would overflow, diseases would spread, and nobody, not even the Lord, would be able to pretend the problem didn't exist. In other words, the gong farmers were the secret custodians of civilization. They were also keepers of private secrets. Anything thrown down a latrine, letters, tokens, mistakes, could be discovered by them. They rarely spoke of what they found, not because they weren't curious, but because telling people you found a nobleman's love letter inside a cesspit was a quick way to get fired, exiled, or turned into a rat's chew toy. One fascinating aspect of their job involved cleaning guardrobes built over castle walls. Some opened directly into moats. Yes, moats were sometimes filled with things you should never fall into. Gong farmers had to clean those too, scraping the edges, clearing blockages, and dealing with the particularly horrifying truth that moat water moved, but not fast enough. At sunrise, their shift ended. They climbed out, exhausted, covered head to toe in regret, and went home to rest. The good news? They had a job where nobody micromanaged them. The bad news? Nobody wanted to stand within 6 feet of them either. Yet thanks to them, the castle remained livable. Gong farmers may not have worn armour or wielded swords, but they kept disease at bay, protected the health of hundreds, and maintained the very foundations of medieval life, quietly at night, while everyone else slept comfortably above. If the medieval castle kitchen was a battlefield of boiling cauldrons, flying poultry feathers, and cooks shouting orders like commanders preparing for war, then the scullions were the poor, exhausted foot soldiers trapped at the very bottom of the hierarchy. Their job wasn't glamorous, not even a little. In fact, you could argue scullions were the medieval version of unpaid interns, except they did get paid, in exhaustion, second-hand burns, and the lingering smell of onions that never fully washed off. A scullion's day began well before the sun had decided whether it even wanted to rise. While noble families were still dreaming about falcon hunts or new velvet gowns, the scullions were already awake, stumbling into the great kitchen with the expression of someone who had made several bad life choices. Their first task? Lighting the fires. And not just one fire, multiple large, stubborn hearths that needed to burn hot enough to cook for an entire castle. Lighting a medieval kitchen fire was like trying to convince damp wood to participate in its own demise. Sparks, kindling, flint, patience, and occasionally swearing were all required. Once the fires caught, the scullions began the never-ending process of hauling water. Medieval kitchens needed water for boiling, washing, brewing, soaking, stewing, and extinguishing the accidental flames that happened every time someone got too creative with fat drippings. But water didn't magically appear from taps. Scullions carried it, bucket after bucket, from wells, streams, or rain barrels, trudging back and forth until their shoulders felt like they might detach in protest. After water came the cleaning, the soul-crushing, pot-scrubbing, dish-washing routine that defined a scullion's existence. Medieval cooking pots were enormous and heavy, coated with layers of soot, grease, and mysterious substances that defied identification. Scullions scraped pots with sand, ash, or coarse brushes until their arms ached. Imagine washing dishes for an entire Thanksgiving feast, every single day, for the rest of your life, without gloves, or dish soap, or emotional support. That was the scullion experience. But cleaning was the easy part. Scullions also handled meat preparation, which medieval cooks approached with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never heard of moderation. Chickens, geese, ducks, pigeons, rabbits, and the occasional unfortunate swan all needed plucking, gutting, and cleaning. Feathers flew like confetti at a very disturbing party. The smell? Let's just say unforgettable. Scullions stood elbow-deep in poultry, yanking feathers with one hand and wiping sweat with the other, while cooks yelled things like, "Don't tear the skin! Don't waste the liver! Why does that chicken look offended?" And then there were fish, slippery, bony, and smelling like the ocean's revenge. Scullions descaled fish, chopped heads, cleaned guts, and tried desperately not to send anything sliding across the table like a rebellious eel making a break for freedom. Vegetables weren't much kinder, endless piles of leeks. Onions, carrots, and cabbages needed peeling and chopping. A scullion's hands never stopped moving. Chop, scrape, peel, chop again. Their fingers developed calluses thick enough to be jealous of armour. The cooks, meanwhile, soared above them like culinary generals, adding spices, stirring pots, and taking credit for dishes the scullions had spent half a day preparing. And all the while the heat. The medieval kitchen was a furnace with fires blazing, pots simmering, sits turning, and steam rising until the room felt like a sauna run by demons. Scullions worked through it all, sweating profusely, and occasionally questioning whether they were cooking the meal or slowly cooking themselves. When they weren't chopping, plucking, cleaning, or hauling, scullions acted as kitchen runners. They fetched ingredients, they carried trays, they delivered messages, they handled spills, breakages, and whatever fresh disaster happened when a cook shouted, "Catch that goose!" Only a scullion knew the true horror of watching a half-plucked bird escape across a kitchen floor, flapping indignantly and spreading panic. Scullions also processed ingredients that required, let's say, emotional resilience, grinding grains by hand, crushing herbs with giant mortars, scraping bones for stock, squeezing cheese curds, washing intestines for sausage casings, a job that required both strength and denial. Anything unpleasant or time-consuming landed in the scullion's lap. Mealtimes were chaos. For noble feasts, the kitchen turned into an orchestra of madness. Pots boiling, animal roasting, dough rising, cooks shouting, and scullions sprinting between tasks like overworked ants trying to avoid being stepped on. During these moments, they learned the first rule of castle kitchens: never make the head cook angry. A cook in a bad mood could hurl insults, wooden spoons, ladles, or instructions so complicated they made astronomy look simple. Ironically, the scullions rarely saw the feast itself. While nobles carved their roasted peacocks and dipped bread into luxurious sauces, scullions were in the kitchen cleaning up pot number 87, wiping down tables, and preparing the next round of dishes. If they were lucky, they got leftovers, though leftovers in medieval terms meant whatever was too burnt, too small, too bony, or too mysterious to serve publicly. By nightfall, scullions were exhausted beyond language. Their feet ached, their clothes were stained, their hands were nicked, and their hair smelled like wood smoke mixed with onion regret. They collapsed onto the straw beds, knowing tomorrow would repeat the exact same chaos. The good news, scullions were indispensable. The bad news, they were indispensable in the exact way a mop is indispensable. Still, many scullions used the job as a stepping stone. With enough years of suffering and skill, a lucky few could become cooks or even head kitchen staff. But until then, they endured the heat, the smells, the orders, and the avalanche of chores that defined their lives, quietly fueling the entire castle one scraped pot and plucked goose at a time. If the medieval kitchen was a fiery underworld of sizzling pans and booming cauldrons, then the spit boys, also known as turnspits, were the souls eternally condemned to rotate meat in the hottest corner of culinary hell. They were usually boys, sometimes orphans, sometimes the children of peasants sent to learn responsibility, and sometimes unfortunate youngsters who made the mistake of standing in the wrong place when someone shouted, "We need another one!" However they got there, the spit boys found themselves stationed beside a roaring hearth, turning a long iron rod full of roasting meat for hours at a time, powered entirely by sweat, desperation, and the faint hope of a lunch break. The spit itself was a medieval masterpiece of engineering, a horizontal metal rod skewering entire animals, pigs, sheep, cows, deer, or anything with enough meat to feed a castle. Attached were gears, hooks, and dripping pan to catch the fat before it turned the kitchen floor into a slip hazard. The problem? None of it rotated automatically. It rotated manually. And that manual part was the spit boy, who sat or crouched close enough to the fire to feel like he was being slowly toasted along with the dinner. His job was brutally simple: keep turning, too slow, and the meat burned on one side, too fast and it cooked unevenly. Stop turning entirely, and the head cook would appear like a demon summoned by incompetence. Every castle cook had a deeply personal relationship with perfection, and spit boys were the unfortunate apprentices who bore the psychological weight of it. Turning the spit required endurance. It wasn't a quick twist every few minutes. It was a constant, steady rotation for hours. Imagine cranking a medieval-sized rotisserie while sitting beside a furnace and inhaling smoke so thick you could taste it. The heat blasted the spit boy's face, sparks occasionally leapt out, fat dripped and sizzled, and the fire popped loudly, sending embers flying in a manner most people today would call a lawsuit waiting to happen. But there were no lawyers here. There was only the spit boy in his slowly crisping misery. The clothing didn't help. Wearing wool near a fire is exactly as uncomfortable as it sounds. The boys frequently worked with sleeves rolled up, sweat running down their backs, hair sticking to their foreheads, and eyes watering from smoke. If they were lucky, they rotated shifts with another spit boy. If unlucky, they were the only one assigned, and their arms would feel like overcooked noodles by the end of the day. The kitchen's heat was one thing, but the smell was another. On bad days, the spit boy smelled like burnt fat, smoked meat, and regret. On good days, he smelled like just burnt fat and regret. After 8 hours beside the fire, his skin felt tight. His hair smelled like roast dinner, and his clothes absorbed so much smoke they practically became firewood. And then there was the dripping pan beneath the spit, an innocent-looking tray catching all the fat and juices. This pan had two personalities. One, the practical collection spot for meat drippings used to baste the roast and make sauces. Two, a liquid hazard that sometimes needed emptying mid-roast. Yes, the spit boy had to carefully tilt and drain a pan of dangerously hot grease, while still continuing to turn the spit. If multitasking today feels overwhelming, imagine juggling molten fat in a room, lit by open Cook yelled instructions, Jai. Don't spill that, boy. It's worth more than your wages. Some castles experimented with mechanical turning systems, usually weighted pulleys or simple gears, but these were unreliable, prone to breaking, and far more difficult to fix than simply grabbing the nearest child and telling him to start turning. Innovation bowed to practicality, and practicality bowed to whoever was closest and smallest. In a few rare places, castles employed turnspit dogs, small wheel-running dogs trained to run inside a rotating treadmill-like contraption attached to the spit. And while these dogs spared boys from some labour, they introduced new problems: dogs refusing to run, dogs running too fast, dogs getting distracted, and cook shouting, "For heaven's sake, someone go motivate the dog!" So the boys remained indispensable. Spit boys weren't just human motors, they were also targets for kitchen lectures. Cooks used them as involuntary audiences for opinions about seasoning, roasting times, the moral decline of youth, and long rants about how no one turns a spit like they used to. A spit boy turned, and listened, and nodded, because arguing with the person holding a ladle of boiling broth was never wise. Their work wasn't limited to turning. They also gathered firewood, justed the hearth, fetched more coals, and occasionally repositioned the roast with tools that looked like medieval torture instruments. The burns on their hands were badges of culinary survival. Every spit boy carried a few, but for all the suffering, the position did offer one perk: food. They worked closest to the roast, and while stealing was dangerous, leftovers often came their way. When the feast ended, the spit boy might receive a chunk of meat still warm from the fire, an edible reward for hours of sweat, heat, and existential questioning. By the time the hearth fires dimmed and the roasts were carved, the spit boys were exhausted. Their arms trembled, their clothes were smoked through, their faces were flushed red, and they smelled like a walking banquet. But after a day of turning meat until they questioned the nature of time itself, they collapsed into their beds, hopeful that tomorrow's roast was at least smaller. The good news? They fed the entire castle. The bad news? They did so by slowly roasting themselves next to the dinner. If you think your job has stress, consider the medieval cupbearer, a person whose entire career revolved around handing someone a drink and hoping it didn't immediately kill them. In a world where poisoning was the medieval equivalent of solving your problems quickly, the cupbearer was both a symbol of trust and the most expendable insurance policy alive. Their title may sound elegant, but their daily reality was closer to, "Here, drink this and pray." Being a cupbearer wasn't simply about pouring wine into a goblet. It was a high-stakes security role, comparable to walking around with a target on your back while also trying not to spill anything. Only the most trusted servants were chosen because the Lord's life literally depended on them. If something went wrong, everyone looked at the cupbearer first. Not the cook, not the wine merchant, not the slightly suspicious envoy from the neighbouring kingdom. No, it was always the cupbearer. At the root of their job description was a terrifying responsibility: taste everything first. Every drink, wine, ale, mead, herbal infusions, celebratory beverages, even water when paranoia peaked, went through the cupbearer's mouth before it reached the Lord's. The idea was simple: if the cupbearer didn't drop dead, the drink was safe. This, as you can imagine, was not the greatest employee benefit package. Nor was there any consistent method for detecting poison. Medieval people didn't have test strips, chemistry sets, or fancy antidotes. They relied on three main strategies. Watch the cupbearer. If he didn't collapse within a few minutes, the drink was declared probably fine. Smell the cup. This worked only if the poison smelled like death or onions, God's protection. A shaky safety net at best. Cupbearers developed remarkable poker faces, because even the slightest cough or throat clear during tasting could send guests screaming and knights reaching for swords. And the tasting was just the beginning. Before drinks even reached the table, the cupbearer oversaw every step of their journey. They inspected bottles, pitchers, and barrels for tampering. They made sure corks weren't replaced poorly, stoppers weren't loose, and liquid surfaces weren't suspiciously oily. They memorized who touched what. They watched the wine steward pour, watched the servants carry, and watched the lord drink, because paranoia was not a flaw in this job. It was the entire skill set. The cupbearer's position put them physically close to the lord during meals, ceremonies, and private gatherings. This proximity came with honour in one sense, standing beside the most important person in the castle, but also great inconvenience. They had to remain alert, upright, and dignified at all times, even while balancing a goblet that sloshed unpredictably, while holding trays heavy enough to double as siege equipment. They weren't allowed to look tired. They weren't allowed to look bored. They weren't allowed to look like they were internally screaming, and they overheard everything. Court gossip, military plans, family arguments, scandals, confessions, rivalries. The cupbearer knew more secrets than a priest, a clerk, and 3 nosy servants combined. But unlike a gossiping maid, the cupbearer had to keep silent. One slip, one badly timed whisper, and suddenly everyone suspected that the person who served drinks was also serving information to someone else. A cupbearer's most valuable skill after surviving poison was knowing when to pretend they didn't hear anything at all. During feasts or celebrations, their workload skyrocketed. Refilling goblets, managing drinks for dozens of guests, staying vigilant for sabotage, and maintaining perfect posture was exhausting. Imagine being responsible for keeping track of who needed refills while watching for subtle attempts at murder. And remember, medieval fall feasts could last hours. By the time musicians packed up, the cupbearer probably tasted more wine than medically advisable, but still had to remain steady. Outside of ceremonies, the cupbearer supervised the storage and safeguarding of beverages in the castle's buttery or wine cellar. The bottles had to be locked, the keys carefully guarded, inventories maintained. If a single cask was out of place, suspicion erupted like a medieval soap opera. Someone could be plotting something, or maybe the cellar boy just counted incorrectly. Either way, the cupbearer was expected to know. And then there was the awkwardness of public poisoning attempts. Once in a while, someone truly bold tried to slip something into the lord's cup at the table. The cupbearer had to react fast, sometimes intercepting hands, sometimes spilling the drink accidentally, the most heroic clumsiness in history, and sometimes performing a dramatic tasting demonstration to reassure the lord. If their face didn't melt off, the feast continued. But the most surprising part of the cupbearer's life was their relationship with the lord. They often became confidants, advisors, or favoured attendants. When someone watches your drink daily to keep you alive, you tend to bond with them. Some cupbearers rose to high positions, managing household operations, influencing decisions, or even becoming noblemen in their own right. Loyalty forged in fear is still loyalty after all. Even so, every cupbearer lived with the awareness that one mistake, a moment of inattention, a bottle overlooked, a malicious hand too quick to intercept could end everything. The good news, they were respected, trusted, integral to the lord's safety. The bad news, their job was essentially keep your boss alive or die trying. By the end of the day, cupbearers retired to their chambers with relief knowing they had successfully not been poisoned and not accidentally poisoned anyone else. For them, a peaceful day was defined not by calm but by survival, and tomorrow they would raise the goblet once more. If the medieval castle were a business, and let's be honest, it essentially was, then the reeve was the overworked manager who handled everything except the glory. While the lord strutted around making grand decisions like, build me a bigger hall, or I want more peacocks at dinner, the reeve dealt with the gritty details of keeping the estate running. He was the human equivalent of an Excel sheet, organised, efficient, stressfully full of data, and occasionally on the verge of crashing. Unlike many castle workers who performed physical labour, the reeve worked in the nebulous world of administration, which meant he spent his days juggling numbers, disputes, schedules, labour assignments, and the constant sense that everyone wanted something from him. The reeve didn't simply farm, he coordinated the farming of hundreds of acres through dozens of peasants, ensuring none of them suddenly decided feudal obligations were optional. Every morning he started with inspections. The reeve checked fields, barns, tools, livestock pens, orchards, paddocks, granaries, and anything else capable of breaking, dying, rotting, disappearing, or being stolen by a neighbour who insisted, "I thought that was my cow." He counted sheep, pigs, oxen, chickens, and geese with a precision that would impress a modern accountant. One missing goat? Annoying but manageable. 2 missing goats? Suspicious. 3 missing goats? Now this was a situation requiring interrogation, paperwork, and stern conversation. Everything under the Lord's economic control fell under the reeve's responsibilities. Harvest yields, crop rotation, seed storage, tool distribution, labour quotas, seasonal planning, ploughing schedules, repairs, tenant rent collection. It was like running a small country while also trying not to upset the man who technically owned your existence. Because the reeve worked closely with the peasants and villagers, he knew everything that happened on the estate. Who was late on rent, who was secretly a terrible ploughman, whose cow had wandered into someone else's fields again, whose roof was leaking, and who was grumbling about taxes. If gossip were grain, the reeve's mind was the granary, but unlike regular gossip, he didn't get to enjoy it. He had to manage it before it turned into a problem. One of his thorniest duties was handling disputes. In a medieval rural community, people could and did argue about anything. Land boundaries, grading rights, who owed whom a chicken, which fence belonged to what family, and whether someone's pigs were looking at someone else's pigs with bad intentions. The reeve acted as mediator, judge, negotiator, and sometimes referee. He had to remain neutral, even when both parties shouted in his face while waving garden tools like dueling weapons. And then came the joy of rent collection. Peasants didn't pay in coins very often. They paid in produce, grain, livestock, eggs, hay, and whatever else they had managed to avoid eating during winter. The reeve recorded every payment in detailed rolls and made sure the Lord's granary was full enough to prevent a meltdown. If someone fell behind on rent, the reeve had to enforce penalties, arrange repayment plans, or report them to the Lord. None of which made him popular during festivals. Despite all this responsibility, the reeve wasn't a noble. He was often a peasant elected by other villagers or appointed by the Lord. For the villagers, electing someone meant they picked the least terrifying candidate. For the Lord, appointing someone meant choosing the person who looked most likely to say, "Yes, my lord," without blinking. The reeve walked a constant tightrope between the peasants and the Lord. Too harsh and the villagers despised him, too soft and the Lord grew suspicious. So the reeve mastered the art of strategic diplomacy, giving everyone just enough of what they wanted to avoid revolt. He knew which peasants worked slowly but honestly, which ones worked fast but complained loudly, which ones needed extra supervision, and which ones would pretend to have injured ankles the moment harvest season arrived. Harvest was his personal nightmare. The reeve had to organise labour teams, ensure tools were ready, arrange oxen for ploughing, secure storage space, track yields, prevent theft, and oversee long workdays while worrying about weather, pests, and anyone slacking behind a haystack. By the end of harvest, the reeve looked like a man who had fought a war against wheat and barely survived. He also monitored repairs and construction around the estate. Broken fences, damaged mills, roof tiles ripped off in storms. He assigned workers, sourced materials, and inspected results. Every structure from barns to dovecotes required attention, and the reeve needed to ensure everything remained functional. If something collapsed due to neglect, the Lord rarely blamed the workers. He blamed the reeve. And the paperwork, oh, the paperwork. The reeve worked with account rolls, tally sticks, receipts, crop lists, livestock inventories, and annual audits. His records had to be immaculate. A single incorrect number could lead to accusations of fraud or incompetence, neither of which ended well for anyone in medieval times. Despite the stress, the reeve held a strangely powerful position. He had authority. People listened to him. His judgment shaped village life. He managed wealth, labour and logistics in ways that made the castle's prosperity possible. He wasn't glamorous, but he was essential. Without him, chaos would spread through the estate faster than a rumour about a witch in the next parish. At sundown, while peasants trudged home and the lord prepared for dinner, the reeve continued tallying figures by candlelight, calculating how to keep everything running smoothly tomorrow. The good news, the reeve kept the entire estate functioning. The bad news, he was the only person who understood how, which meant he could never take a day off without the world falling apart. In a medieval world where most people's signatures looked like someone fell asleep on a quill, the castle clerk existed as a rare, almost mystical figure, a person who could read, write, count, and, most impressively, remain calm while doing all three at once. If the reeve was the castle's spreadsheet, the clerk was the entire administrative office, complete with filing system, mailroom, accounting department, PR division, and occasional therapy services for nobles who needed their thoughts turned into coherent sentences. Clerks were sometimes monks in training, sometimes educated sons of minor nobles, sometimes ambitious commoners who had managed to convince someone they could write legibly. Whatever their background, they became the keepers of the castle's vast and endless paperwork, an unglamorous but vital job in a society that relied on records to maintain order and prevent the lord from asking embarrassing questions like, "Do we own 3 horses or 7? And why does this cow look unfamiliar?" The clerk's day began in the castle's small writing chamber, often a chilly room filled with scrolls, ink pots, parchment rolls, wax seals, and an ominous pile of unfinished documents that seemed to grow overnight like a bureaucratic fungus. Candles flickered, drafts blew dust across the table, and quills lay soaked in ink that somehow always managed to splash onto clothing not designed for stain removal. The first task was correspondence. Nobles loved writing letters. They wrote to allies, relatives, rivals, church leaders, merchants, and sometimes even people they disliked just to sound polite while subtly insulting them. But they didn't write them personally, they dictated them to the clerk. This meant the clerk spent large portions of his day sitting quietly, while the lord paced back and forth, offering chaotic fragments such as, "Write that I am displeased. Actually, write that I am very displeased. But also write that I'm open to negotiations. No, that sounds weak. Write something but courteous, but threatening." The clerk then had to turn this emotional tornado into a perfectly phrased letter, ensuring it conveyed just the right amount of irritation and without accidentally starting a war. And after that, duplicate copies for the record, copies for the archive, copies for the messenger, copies in case the messenger dropped the first copy into a puddle. Next came accounting, the part of the clerk's job that drained the soul faster than a monk fasting during Lent. He tracked the lord's finances, recorded incoming rents in coins, grain, cloth, chickens, or whatever the reeve dropped off, and logged expenses such as troop payments, supply orders, construction materials, and inexplicably large purchases of spices for the cook. Every entry had to be precise. The lord rarely remembered last month's expenses, but he definitely remembered when something seemed missing. Inventories were another never-ending task. The clerk maintained detailed lists of weapons in the armoury, lengths of fabric in storage, barrels in the pantry, candles in the chapel, tools in the workshop, tapestries in the guest rooms, books in the library, if the castle had such luxury. If an item disappeared, the clerk was the first to hear about it, usually from someone shouting, "Where did the good silver plate go?" To which the clerk calmly replied, "Please stop yelling at the paperwork, it didn't steal anything." Legal documents were equally thrilling. Contracts, agreements, land grants, tax exemptions, dowries, marriage arrangements, testimonies, edicts, complaints. Everything passed through the clerk's hands. If someone needed to make an official declaration, the clerk wrote it. If someone wanted to sue their neighbour for stealing a chicken, the clerk transcribed the accusation. If someone needed proof they paid rent last year, the clerk rummaged through scrolls like an archaeologist searching for lost treasure. And through all of this, the clerk had to maintain a professional expression, even when the content being dictated was absurd. "Write that my neighbour's rooster is possessed by demons and demands investigation," the Lord's uncle might say. The clerk would dip his quill, nod politely and think, "Yes, of course, completely reasonable." Because literacy was rare, the clerk held a quiet kind of power. He shaped official records. He chose the wording that future generations might read. He preserved the castle's memory, long after the people in it had forgotten their own decisions. A clerk could make someone look responsible, foolish, heroic, or questionable simply by choosing a phrase. Not that he would, of course. He was impartial, mostly. Outside of writing, the clerk acted as the castle's scheduler. He tracked appointments, meetings, estate inspections, feast preparations, guest arrivals, military musters, and the timing of dues. If the Lord had 5 commitments in one afternoon, the clerk ensured none of them overlapped catastrophically. If the Lord forgot an appointment, which he often did, the clerk gently reminded him in a tone that translated to, "I am saving your dignity once again, please appreciate this." Sometimes the clerk tutored the children of the castle, teaching them letters, numbers, scripture, and the ability to read contracts before accidentally agreeing to unpaid labour for life. Other times he copied manuscripts for the chapel, or drafted proclamations to be read aloud in the village square. His writing shaped the castle's communication with the outside world, from tax notices to diplomatic greetings, and yet, despite nearly drowning in ink and responsibility, the clerk was expected to remain invisible, quiet, steady, and emotionless. He listened to secrets, resolved misunderstandings, and maintained order through careful documentation. He was the castle's memory, its record keeper, and its voice in written form. By the end of each day, the clerk's fingers were stained black, his back ached from bending over parchment, and his eyes felt like they had aged 5 years in one afternoon. But he closed the account rolls with satisfaction, knowing that without him, the castle would collapse into administrative chaos in approximately 12 minutes. The good news, he had intellectual authority in a world that valued literacy deeply. The bad news, everyone assumed that because he wrote everything down, he had time to do even more work tomorrow. If medieval status symbols came with wings, talons, and an ego that could blot out the sun, they belonged to the falconer. In a world where nobles measured prestige by how many exotic animals they could parade around without getting bitten, falconry reigned supreme. A falconer didn't just handle birds, he handled royal expectations, predator personalities, and the constant possibility of losing a very expensive animal because it decided it didn't feel like coming back today. Falconry was so elite that owning and flying certain birds was restricted by class. Kings and princes claimed gerfalcons, high nobles flaunted peregrines, lesser nobles got merlins, and peasants got to look at birds in the sky and feel poor. But no matter which creature perched on the Lord's gauntlet, one person made the entire operation function: the falconer. He lived on the castle grounds but slightly apart, usually near the mews, the falconry houses where birds were kept in carefully designed enclosures. These buildings were half stable, half luxury suite, and half danger zone, filled with the smell of feathers, leather, meat scraps, and the unmistakable scent of "do not stick your fingers in here." Inside, elegant hawks perched silently, staring with the intense concentration of creatures who knew they were both beloved and deadly. The falconer's day began early. Birds needed feeding at dawn, and their meals weren't simple grain mixes or polite pellets. No, falcons ate fresh meat, usually supplied by the falconer himself. He handled pieces of rabbit, quail, or pigeon with the casual comfort of someone who long ago accepted that his hands would permanently smell like refrigerated wildlife. The hawks watched every movement with laser focus. If he took too long, a bird might lean forward in a way that communicated very clearly, "Feed me, human servant, or I will file a complaint with my talons." Feeding was only the warm-up. The true work began with the falconer's most delicate skill: managing a bird's temperament. Falcons were not pets. They tolerated humans the same way royalty tolerated peasants, with a mix of superiority, impatience, and occasional cooperation. Their moods varied daily. One morning a bird might sit calmly as he fitted its jesses, thin leather straps around the legs. The next, it might decide the falconer's hand looked like a chew toy. Training a hawk required patience bordering on sainthood. First came manning, the introductory stage where the bird learned not to panic around humans. This involved hours of the falconer sitting with the bird perched on his glove, talking to it, stroking its feathers, and ignoring the mild existential dread of having razor-sharp talons inches from his arteries. The goal was simple: get the bird comfortable enough that it wouldn't fly into the next county at the first opportunity. Next came fly training. The falconer used a lure, usually a feathered or fur-covered weight swung on a rope, to teach the hawk to dive, strike, and return. When the bird obeyed, it earned a treat: a small strip of meat. Hawks quickly understood the pattern. Listen to the falconer, get food. Ignore the falconer, go hungry. Hawks were independent enough to consider their options daily, but the falconer couldn't rely on training alone. He also needed physical conditioning, flight sessions, weight control, and constant observation. A falcon that was too heavy wouldn't return to the glove. One that was too light became dangerous, unpredictable, or prone to flying off and never returning. Thus, the falconer kept meticulous feeding logs and adjusted rations with the seriousness of a medieval nutritionist. The relationship between the lord and his birds flowed entirely through the falconer. He selected which hawk was appropriate for each hunt. He supervised release timings. He advised the lord on weather conditions, wind direction, terrain, prey availability, and how not to frighten the bird through excessive enthusiasm. During hunts, the falconer ran alongside the nobles, watching the sky with the skill of someone who'd spent years staring upward and squinting dramatically, and if a bird didn't return immediately, the falconer chased it. Across fields, through forests, over streams, into awkward conversations with villagers who said things like, "Aye, a great bird swooped over the barn, took my best rooster with it." Losing a bird meant losing prestige, and losing prestige meant losing your job, possibly your sanity, maybe even your hands, depending on how dramatic the lord felt that week. But falconry success carried heavy rewards. A well-trained hawk could catch rabbits, pheasants, partridges, cranes, and other game. Each successful dive made the lord beam with pride, as if he had done the hard work, not the bird or the falconer sprinting after it with breathless determination. The falconer also handled medical care. Birds, for all their majesty, were delicate. A broken feather, swollen eye, strained wing, or cracked talon required immediate attention. The falconer kept ointments, bandages, tiny splints, and a mental Rolodex of every known bird ailment. He could diagnose problems by sight, touch, and sometimes sound. No one underestimated the importance of listening to a hawk cough. But the greatest challenge wasn't feeding, training, or healing. It was dealing with the birds' personalities, which ranged from quiet professional to diva with wings. Some birds refused to hunt in damp weather. Some attacked the lure with excessive dramatic flair. Some screamed for reasons no human ear wished to contemplate. One particularly notorious type, the goshawk, was so temperamental that falconers nicknamed them the Butcher, a cheerful label meaning dangerously aggressive and prone to tantrums, yet despite all the claw marks and emotional trauma, falconers took pride in their role. They were craftsmen, experts, artists who shaped wild predators into disciplined hunters, and nobles adored them for it. At sunset, the falconer returned birds to their mews, checked their perches, cleaned the housings, and prepared meat for the next morning. Then, exhausted and often bleeding slightly, he closed the mew door knowing tomorrow he would once again negotiate with feathery aristocrats holding very sharp opinions. The good news? He worked with the most spectacular animals in the medieval world. The bad news? Those animals knew it, and behaved accordingly. If medieval castles had an outdoor action department, the huntsmen were its elite unit. They were part animal tracker, part forest police, part dog trainer, part butcher and part tour guide for nobles who wanted their food to come with a thrilling chase scene. In a world where hunting wasn't merely a hobby but a declaration of status, the huntsmen ensured the lord's daily entertainment ran smoothly, and that something impressive and edible eventually reached the castle kitchens. A huntsman's day started long before the sun rose, when the forest was still wrapped in mist and the animals were too sleepy to judge anyone. His first task? The kennels. Medieval hunting dogs were the pride of an estate, sleek greyhounds for speed, sturdy mastiffs for strength, scent hounds for tracking, spaniels for flushing, and sometimes foreign breeds brought in specifically to look expensive. The huntsman fed, watered, brushed, and checked every dog, making sure none were limping, injured, or mysteriously missing because a noble's dog going missing was the medieval equivalent of a diplomatic crisis. Kennel life was loud. Dogs barked, howled, whined, and occasionally fought over hierarchy or bones, and the huntsman handled it all with the patience of someone deeply used to chaos. He cleaned bedding, repaired fencing, scrubbed feeding troughs, and dealt with the less glamorous parts of dog care, the kinds of tasks that made even gong farmers say, "Good luck with that." Once the dogs were settled, the huntsman moved on to tracking and scouting. He walked the forest trails at dawn, reading prints, scat broken twigs, disturbed soil, and those mysterious signs that only professional trackers and conspiracy theorists can interpret. Deer, boar, hares, foxes, and even wolves left trails that needed mapping. A good huntsman recognized not only species, but also size, age, speed, direction, and how recently the animal had passed. If a lord asked, "Is there good game today?" the huntsman answered with a confidence built on hours of analysing dirt. When hunting day arrived, the huntsman became the coordinator of a full-scale outdoor production. Nobles wanted excitement, spectacle, and bragging rights. The huntsman ensured they got all three without getting lost, trampled, mauled, or stuck in a tree. He selected which dogs to bring, where to begin the search, how to flush game into open areas, and which routes were safe enough for the noble riders who seemed magnetically drawn to hazards. A medieval hunt was not a casual stroll. It was a noisy, fast-paced chase involving riders, footmen, horn signals, barking dogs, and animals desperately trying to avoid becoming dinner. The huntsman ran, shouted commands, blew horns, and directed the entire operation like a conductor guiding an orchestra of chaos. There were multiple types of hunts: coursing hunts, dogs chased down hares or deer in open areas. Huntsmen paced alongside, shouting strategies like sports coaches, yelling at athletes who absolutely could not understand human speech. Boar hunts, the most dangerous. Wild boars were aggressive, fast, and armed with tusks sharp enough to ruin several afternoons. Huntsmen coordinated dogs, armed riders, and spear carriers so the noble wouldn't end up as boar decor. Falcon-assisted hunts, sometimes combined with hawks, meaning the huntsman had to work alongside the falconer without letting dogs chase the birds or vice versa. Forest stalks, quiet, slow hunts where the huntsman guided nobles through dense woodland, pointing out trails and teaching them how not to step on every loud twig in the kingdom. Regardless of the style, the huntsman maintained control. A noble might shout, "I want that one," while pointing at an animal already sprinting into another county, and the huntsman would sigh internally before figuring out how to make it happen. After the chase came the kill, and once the noble took the credit, the huntsman took over again. He field-dressed the animal, removing organs and preparing the meat for the safe transport. This required skill, speed, and strong nerves. Boars especially did not leave this world politely. The huntsman then carried or carted the carcass back to the castle, ensuring the dogs stayed out of trouble and the noble stayed proud. But hunting wasn't just about food or bragging. It was also about forest law, something the huntsman enforced with seriousness. Medieval hunting lands were protected like royal treasure. Unauthorized hunting was a crime punishable by fines, imprisonment, mutilation, or, in the case of killing royal deer, death. The huntsman patrolled the forests, catching poachers, monitoring traps, and preventing neighbouring villagers from deciding just one rabbit wouldn't hurt. He knew the faces of known troublemakers, kept mental maps of poacher hideouts, and sometimes staged dramatic confrontations worthy of a medieval version of a crime drama. The huntsman also maintained equipment: leashes, collars, spears, nets, horns, whistles, bows and tracking tools. Nothing was allowed to be dull, rotten or unreliable, especially when one small mistake could lead to a noble being chased by an angry boar on a bad-tempered horse. During feasts and festivals, the huntsman played a role too. He prepared displays of game, presented trophies, antlers, hides, tusks, and occasionally demonstrated proper hunting techniques to impressed guests who had no intention of ever trying them. The role required stamina, courage, intelligence, and charm. Huntsmen weren't anonymous workers. They spent time with nobles outdoors, advising them during hunts, saving them from accidents, and occasionally preventing them from making catastrophic choices like trying to pet a wolf. Lords respected their skills deeply. Sometimes the huntsman became a close companion, privy to private conversations, political frustrations, and stories that sounded more impressive after a few goblets of wine. But behind the glamour of noble hunts was the huntsman's daily grind. Muddy boots, tired dogs, wounded game, endless miles walked, and constant vigilance. He lived half his life outdoors, half his life in the kennels, and all of his life surrounded by fur, danger, and animals with stronger survival instincts than the nobles who chased them. The good news? He enjoyed one of the most exciting, respected careers in the castle. The bad news? Everything he worked with had teeth, hooves, horns, or the ability to sprint faster than his dignity. In a medieval castle, the castellan was the person who kept the entire fortress functioning when the lord was absent, indisposed, uninterested, or distracted by a hunting trip that somehow lasted 3 weeks. If the castle were a vast machine of stone, steel, and questionable decisions, the castellan was the engineer who kept every cog turning smoothly. He was the deputy lord, the stand-in commander, the emergency administrator, and the poor soul responsible for solving crises that always seemed to arrive at the worst possible moment. To understand the castellan's life, you must picture a castle not as a single building, but as a miniature city. Soldiers, servants, livestock, workshops, storerooms, visitors, prisoners, pets with bad attitudes, and assorted nobles wandering around looking important. Someone had to coordinate all of this, and that someone was the castellan. His day began early, often before sunrise, because problems loved to wake up early too. The castellan made rounds through the courtyard, barracks, stables, storerooms, gatehouse and workshops, checking for anything out of place. This included broken hinges, missing tools, absent soldiers, suspiciously wilted supplies, or the alarming sight of someone's goat where no goat should logically be. Every issue became his issue. The heart of his duty lay in military oversight. The castellan ensured that soldiers trained regularly, guards knew their rotations, weapons were maintained, armour remained serviceable and discipline stayed firm. He inspected the garrison with a keen eye, ready to scold anyone whose helmet was dented, whose spear had gone missing, or whose boots looked like they had been chewed on by fate. He organised drills, supervised archery practice, enforced punishments, and made sure that morale didn't collapse like a badly built tower. A castle with bored soldiers was a castle asking for trouble. Fights, gambling binges, and creative accidents involving siege equipment. The castellan's job was to keep the troops focused and functional, even when they preferred sleep or ale. But military strength wasn't the only thing on his mind. The castellan also managed supplies, which meant he had to think like a strategist with a shopping addiction. Grain stores, salted meats, dried fruits, wine barrels, oil jars, candles, firewood and dispenser, and medicinal herbs all needed constant monitoring. If supplies ran low, he arranged procurement. If they ran too low, he panicked internally while maintaining a calm face externally. He controlled distribution too, which involved calculating rations so the castle could survive winter, or, worse, a siege. Speaking of sieges, The castellan oversaw defensive readiness. He ensured the battlements were stable, the gates functional, the drawbridge sturdy, the portcullis operational, and the stores of stones, arrows, and boiling substances fully stocked. If the lord left instructions like "prepare for potential threats," the castellan interpreted this as "fix everything before I get back, or I will blame you for the weather too." He also maintained relationships with key staff, the armourer, the smith, the kitchen overseer, the steward, and the reeve. Every department intersected with his responsibilities. If repairs stalled, he intervened. If workshops conflicted, he mediated. If servants squabbled, he resolved it. And if anyone said, "The Lord told me I didn't have to listen to you," the castellan responded with the look of a man imagining how satisfying it would be to place them on latrine cleaning duty for a month. Much of his work required diplomacy. Visitors arrived with demands, messengers brought news, envoys requested audience, and minor nobles asked for favours. The castellan greeted them, judged their intentions, directed them to accommodations, and politely prevented them from wandering into rooms they had no business exploring. He learned to say "My lord is away at present," with a tone that implied nothing suspicious was happening, even when something absolutely was. One of his most overlooked duties was managing schedules. Feasts, inspections, tax collections, troop musters, maintenance days, and religious observances all had to be woven into a coherent calendar. A poorly timed feast could ruin a military drill. A maintenance day scheduled during a noble visit could lead to impolite levels of shouting. The castellan balanced everything with the precision of a juggler handling flaming torches. When the lord was present, the castellan worked in the background, offering advice, clarifying details, and gently reminding the lord of practical matters like, "The south tower needs repairs," or "We can't hold another banquet, we ran out of wine last week." When the lord travelled, the castellan became the acting authority. The castle trusted him because he knew every part of it, the creaking doors, the moody guards, the overworked cooks, and the places where the walls were definitely thicker on paper than in reality. And then there were emergencies. Fires, floods, escaped prisoners, sudden storms, surprise inspections, medical crises, and unexpected visitors all fell into his lap. The castellan responded quickly, issuing orders with the urgency of someone who'd handled far too many disasters to be surprised anymore. If the messenger burst in shouting, "Sir, something terrible has happened," the castellan simply closed his eyes for a moment, whispered, "Of course it has," and got to work. Despite the stress, castellanship came with status. He was respected, obeyed, and relied upon. He attended councils, carried keys to restricted areas, wore distinct clothing, and sat in a position of honour at formal meals. People deferred to him, servants trusted him, soldiers depended on him, and the lord, whether he admitted it or not, needed him, but the job demanded constant vigilance. The castle didn't take days off, so neither did he. His nights were filled with late meetings, torch-lit inspections, and anxious strolls through corridors that echoed with the whispers of responsibility. The good news: the castellan had real authority, real respect, and real influence. The bad news: he also had real problems, every single one the castle could generate. If a medieval castle had a soundtrack, the blacksmith provided the heavy percussion section. Hours of hammering, clanging, sizzling, and muttered commentary about metal behaving badly. His forge was the beating, burning heart of castle industry, a place where iron bent, eventually, fire roared, and the blacksmith sweated enough to supply his own personal moat. Unlike nobles whose hands remained soft and dainty, the blacksmith's hands were so calloused they could probably moonlight as armour. The blacksmith's forge sat slightly apart from the main courtyard, not for aesthetic reasons, but because sparks had a habit of flying out and setting fire to anything flammable. Inside, the forge glowed with relentless heat. A central fire pit, a giant anvil, buckets of water and oil, racks of tools that doubled as instruments of torture-looking craftsmanship, and shelves lined with iron bars created an environment equal parts workshop and volcanic shrine. His day began at dawn, when the air was still cool enough that he could pretend working beside a raging fire wouldn't slowly melt his eyebrows. First task, lighting the forge. This involved stacking charcoal, pumping bellows, coaxing flames into cooperation, and getting the fire hot enough that it could soften iron. Blacksmiths had an intimate relationship with fire, one that floating between respectful partnership and constant negotiation with an unpredictable inferno. Once the forge blazed bright, the real work began. The castle relied on the blacksmith to keep its arsenal in fighting condition. Swords dulled, spears broke, arrows needed heads, axes chipped. Soldiers had an uncanny ability to damage equipment in ways that defied logic. How did you bend a sword like this? Well, sir, the tree insulted me. The blacksmith reheated blades until they glowed red, hammered them into shape, quenched them in cold water with a dramatic hiss, then polished and sharpened them. Each step demanded precision. Too much heat and the blade weakened. Too little and it kept its flaws. A sword wasn't just a weapon, it was a statement about the castle's professionalism. The blacksmith ensured that statement wasn't. We fought bravely until our swords fell apart. Armour was another daily project. Knights expected the blacksmith to repair dents, patch holes, replace buckles, and reshape breastplates crushed by minor incidents, such as jousting collisions, falling off horses, or walking directly into walls. Chainmail repairs were the most time-consuming. Hundreds of tiny rings interlocked in patterns that looked more like punishment than practical protection needed inspection and replacement. If a knight came in dragging chainmail with a tear big enough to swallow a small dog, the blacksmith sighed, stretched his fingers, and got to work. Horses were the medieval equivalent of cars, trucks, taxis, and delivery vehicles all in one. And horseshoes? They were the tyres. The blacksmith made and fitted them, adjusting sizes for each unique hoof. Fitting shoes required skill, patience, and trust between the smith and the horse, because if either party made a mistake, someone got kicked, stepped on, or emotionally traumatized. The blacksmith trimmed hooves, measured angles, heated the shoe until it glowed, pressed it onto the hoof to shape it, producing enough smoke to alarm passers-by, then secured it with nails. Horses were usually calm, but not always. A startled horse could create a very exciting workplace environment. The blacksmith wasn't just responsible for glamorous knightly gear. He also forged farming tools, hinges for gates and doors, brackets, hooks, locks, cooking spits, cauldron handles, fire pokers, cartwheels, iron rims, anything that squeaked, snapped, or offended gravity. If a servant rushed in shouting, "The Lord's new gate won't close," the blacksmith stopped what he was doing, grabbed his hammer, and marched over like a stern parent about to discipline the concept of mechanics. Blacksmithing demanded intense physical strength. Hammering iron wasn't a polite tap-tap affair. It was a full-arm swing, repeated thousands of times. The smith's muscles were not just toned, they were legendary. His clothing was permanently marked with soot, holes burned by sparks, and mysterious stains he preferred not to investigate. The heat from the forge made the workshop feel like the inside of a dragon's throat. Even in winter, the smith worked shirt-sleeved, glistening with sweat like a man who had fought the sun and come to a stalemate. Tools heated up, hands calloused over, burns were daily souvenirs. If a blacksmith didn't have at least 3 blisters and a dramatic story by noon, people assumed he was slacking. The castle often judged how busy the smith was by sound alone. The rhythmic clang of hammer on iron echoed across the courtyard like medieval heavy metal music. Those sounds meant progress. They also meant no one could hold a quiet conversation near the workshop without shouting loud enough to frighten birds 3 villages away. When something broke, anything, the first thought was, ask the blacksmith. Tools snapped, go to the smith. Door hinges groaning, smith. Chains rusted, smith. Metal buckle fell off your shoe, smith. Accidentally dropped your favourite pot and cried. Yes, the blacksmith could fix that too. He was the castle's problem solver, repairman, crisis manager, and miracle worker, turning hunks of metal into functioning objects with nothing but fire, muscle, and stubborn determination. While the blacksmith wasn't noble, he held high status. Everyone respected him. Everyone needed him. Even knights spoke politely, partly out of respect, partly because insulting the man who maintains your armour is a questionable life choice. But status did not mean ease. His work was constant, messy, hot, and loud. His arms ached, his clothes were dusty, and his lungs carried the memory of every forge session. At night he collapsed onto his bed, smelling faintly of smoke, steel, and pride. The good news, he was indispensable. The bad news, so was his anvil, and it weighed more than most problems he faced. If the blacksmith forged the tools of war, the armoriera was the technician who kept them functioning and prevented knights from becoming tragically noisy tin cans. Armourers lived in a world of metal edges, moving joints, buckles, screws. Yes, medieval screws existed. Straps, and the constant sound of someone shouting, "Why does this piece not fit anymore?" Their job was to ensure that when a knight rode into battle, he didn't immediately fall apart like an overpriced children's toy. Unlike blacksmiths, whose workshops were a riot of sparks and molten metal, the armourer's space was a hybrid of workshop, tailor's room, and mechanic's garage. Shelves overflowed with gauntlets, greaves, cuirasses, helmets, chainmail shirts, leather straps, and various mysterious plates labelled with markers like left thigh. Because even armourers occasionally doubted where certain pieces belonged. Armour was not one size fits all. A knight was measured like a customer ordering a medieval tuxedo. Chest width, shoulder span, thigh thickness, arm length, and even helmet headroom had to be considered. If a piece fit poorly, the results could be catastrophic. Too tight, and the knight couldn't breathe. Too loose, and incoming weaponry might wander places it absolutely shouldn't. The armourer tightened, loosened, reshaped, hammered, riveted, padded, and stitched armour so each piece aligned with the knight's movements. He had to understand not only metallurgy but also anatomy, where joints bent, how muscles expanded, and how much padding a man required before he looked like a walking mattress. Armour wasn't only functional, it was symbolic. A gleaming suit of armour announced power, prestige, wealth, and dramatic flair. The armourer spent hours polishing every curve and plate with oils, cloths, pumice stones, and abrasive pastes. Dull armour said, "My squire is lazy." Shiny armour said, "Fear me, peasants and enemies alike." Some lords wanted mirror-bright armour. Others preferred darker, matte finishes to avoid sunlight glaring into their eyes mid-charge. The armourer complied with all requests, even the unreasonable ones. If a noble wanted armour that looks like the moonlight but feels like expensive masculinity, the armourer nodded politely and got to work. Weapons maintenance fell squarely into the armourer's domain. Every sword, dagger, axe, and mace required regular sharpening. The armourer used whetstones, grindstones, leather strops, and a practised wrist to ensure blades gleamed with lethal perfection. He judged weapons by sound, how they hissed across stone, how they rang when tapped, how soldiers gasped gratefully when their once dull swords glided cleanly through practice targets instead of bouncing off embarrassingly. But sharpening wasn't the only task. Blades chipped, spears warped, shields cracked. The armourer restored each, sometimes reconstructing entire portions with new rivets, patches, or bindings. He was the medieval equivalent of a repair technician telling knights, "It's fixed, but please stop abusing your equipment." Chainmail, despite looking like metallic fabric, was the armourer's personal nemesis. It was beautiful, it was protective, and it broke constantly. Each shirt contained tens of thousands of tiny rings. Rings snapped, rings tore, ring vanished mysteriously, often discovered later in someone's boot. Repairing chainmail required two tools, pliers, and a near supernatural patience. The armourer replaced rings one by one, weaving them into the pattern so seamlessly that the knight never noticed which part had once been a gaping hole. It was the most tedious work ever invented, rivaled only by medieval bookkeeping and modern tax filing. Whenever a new suit of armour was finished, the knighting ritual of fitting began. A knight didn't simply slip into armour. armour was assembled onto him. The armourer and at least one assistant fastened piece after piece, checking range of motion, adjusting straps, and making sure no plate dug painfully into ribs. The armourer asked questions like, "Can you raise your arm fully? Can you bend at the waist without collapsing? Can you turn your head without sounding like a drawbridge opening?" Knights answered honestly when sober and overconfidently when trying to impress someone. If a piece pinched, the armourer took it back. If a piece rattled, the armourer fixed it. If the entire suit felt wrong, the armourer sighed, rolled up his sleeves and rebuilt half of it. He lived in a cycle of modification and marginal gains, tiny adjustments that collectively meant the difference between elegant combat and tripping over one's own leg plates. During tournaments or battles, the armourer worked like a NASCAR pit crew made of one exhausted man. Knights returned from jousts with dented helmets, fractured visors, snapped straps, or shields with axe wounds. The armourer had minutes, sometimes seconds, to hammer out dents, reforge rivets, and secure buckles so the knight could rejoin the fight without looking like a metallic disaster. He worked with adrenaline pumping, torch flames flickering, and crowds cheering or booing right outside. A helmet that looked like a crushed berry, he fixed it. A gauntlet bent into a claw shape, he fixed it. A visor stuck shut, he yanked it open before the knight overheated. Inside his workspace, the armourer kept rivets by the hundreds, files of every size pliers sharp enough to terrify mallets, hammers, and tongs bandages, because everything was sharp, leather scraps, padding rolls, test dummies, stabbed beyond recognition. The air smelled of oil, steel, sweat, and determination. Armourers weren't nobles, but they held high status. Knights respected them profoundly. Some even feared them. After all, a knight's life depended on the armourer's expertise. One loose strap or unpatched dent could mean disaster on the battlefield. Still, the work was grueling. Armourers suffered wrist pain, back pain, burns, cuts, and the constant ringing in their ears from hammer blows. But they took pride in creating masterpieces of protection, personal fitted suits of armour that turned ordinary men into walking fortresses. The good news, every knight trusted them completely. The bad news, every knight also handed them catastrophically damaged armour and expected miracles by sunset. If medieval castles ran on anything more powerful than politics, it was horses. Horses transported people, pulled carts, carried knights into battle, hauled supplies, delivered messages, and occasionally caused spectacular drama when they didn't feel like participating. And behind every well-trained, gleaming, obedient castle horse stood a small army of stable hands, hard-working labourers who smelled permanently of hay, sweat, leather, and manure. Without them, the castle would grind to a halt faster than a knight falling off a wagon. Stable hands were the earliest risers in the castle. Long before the cooks lit their ovens or the reeve started shouting about missing sheep, the stable hands were already awake, shuffling into the stables with sleep puffy eyes and a determination powered entirely by routine and survival. Their work began with the morning chorus of whinnies, snorts, impatient hoof stomps, and at least one horse banging on a stall door like a furry, muscular alarm clock demanding breakfast. Feeding, the first task in the stable symphony. Horses ate a shocking amount. Oats, barley, hay, grass, and sometimes special feed mixed with herbs or oil, all measured, delivered, and distributed by stable hands who learned quickly which horses were greedy, which were picky, and which were deceptively sweet until they spotted someone else's bucket. Feeding required agility because horses knew exactly what those grain buckets meant. A stable hand who wasn't careful risked being shoved, nudged, stepped on, or surrounded by hungry faces all insisting, "Me first, human me." But despite the chaos, stable hands kept strict feeding routines, diets tailored to age, workload and temperament. One overfed horse turned lazy, one underfed horse turned cranky, and a cranky medieval horse was a public safety hazard. Cleaning stalls, the task that defined the job. If stable hands had a motto, it would be, "Nothing in this world produces waste like a horse." Cleaning stalls was a daily ordeal. Forking out straw, shoveling manure, sweeping, scraping, replacing bedding, and occasionally questioning how a single animal could produce enough to fertilise half the estate. Stall mucking was physically exhausting and spiritually humbling. A stable hand worked bent-backed for hours, dragging heavy barrows to the muck pile and returning to do it again, because horses were not known for their ability to hold it politely. They went when they went, during meals, grooming, saddle fitting, or moments when a stable hand thought, finally a clean stall. The smell was legendary. New stable hands gagged. Experienced ones just shrugged and said, it could be worse. Grooming. The spa treatment horses loved too much to keep horses healthy and to maintain the castle's reputation. Stable hands spent enormous time grooming. Curry combs, brushes, hoof picks, mane combs, cloths and buckets of water all played a role in the daily makeover routine. Grooming wasn't just cosmetic, it improved circulation, prevented skin conditions, removed pests and built trust. But grooming a horse wasn't as peaceful as artwork suggests. Sometimes the horse shifted, sometimes it leaned, all 1,000 pounds of it. Sometimes it sneezed hay into a stable hand's face. Other times it flicked its tail with enough force to slap a man into a new hairstyle. Still, horses loved their grooming sessions. Some even dozed off, leaning dangerously toward the stable hand, who often had to gently push the horse upright before becoming a pancake. Hoof care and tack maintenance. Stable hands picked out hooves daily, removing stones, dirt, and anything else horses had stepped in, which was usually everything. A missed stone could lead to lameness, and lameness meant an unhappy lord, an irritated castellan, and a frantic stable crew. They also inspected and repaired tack. Saddles, bridles, reins, stirrups, girths, halters, harnesses. Leather needed oiling, straps needed replacing, metal fittings needed polishing. A broken girth strap mid-ride could cause a noble to fall dramatically, which was inconvenient for everyone, especially the noble. Training. Every horse needed. Manners. Stable hands often assisted the master of the stables with training. Young spirited horses required patience, gentle cues, consistent routines, and occasionally long walks to calm them down. Stable hands taught new mounts to accept saddles, follow commands, tolerate noisy courtyards, and not bolt the moment a rooster crowed too aggressively. They also desensitized horses to the many weird things that existed in castles: flapping pennants, banging gates, clanking armour, shouting soldiers, dogs, geese, and the occasional jester doing cartwheels for reasons no one understood. Travel, preparation, saddling, packing, and managing noble demands. When the lord travelled, whether for war, diplomacy, or boredom, it was the stable hands who prepared the mounts. They saddled horses, loaded baggage animals, tied gear securely, and kept the animals calm amidst the rush of soldiers or attendants. They had to predict problems before they exploded. A horse too tired, a strap too loose, a saddle placed a fraction of an inch off centre. Stable hands also escorted horses during long travels. They walked beside them, checked hoof health constantly, watered them at rivers, and occasionally slept curled near them on cold nights to keep them from spooking at foxes. Managing personalities, horses had opinions. Every stable hand knew the castle's horses the way a teacher knows every student: which horse kicked, which horse bit sleeves but not skin, which horse hated rain, which horse adored children, which horse demanded attention, which horse pretended to be injured every Monday, which horse held eternal grudges. Horses were not silent servants. They were dramatic, emotional, intelligent creatures who required patience and understanding. Stable hands became amateur psychologists, predicting tantrums, fears, and heroic moments. Respect without recognition. Although they didn't receive noble praise, stable hands held enormous responsibility. A single mistake, poor grooming, loose tack, missed injury, could injure a horse or rider. They were vital to the castle's transportation, communication, agriculture and military readiness. Yet their work was constant, often unglamorous and physically punishing. Dust, sweat, scratches, bruises, and hoof-shaped souvenirs were daily realities. They slept deeply, worked hard, and developed muscles and reflexes that would impress warriors. The good news? Horses loved them. The bad news? Horses also stepped on them regularly. If cleanliness is next to godliness, then medieval laundry workers were the castle's overworked guardian angels, except instead of halos, they wore aprons permanently stained with mystery blotches. These women, and occasionally men, waged daily war against dirt, sweat, stains, grease, and odours, so potent they could have been classified as new species. In an age where hygiene was, let's say, aspirational, laundry workers performed miracles that nobody celebrated but everybody desperately relied on. Their domain wasn't the pleasant sunlit laundry rooms we picture today. Medieval laundry happened in a hot, steamy, chaotic battleground of wash tubs, boiling pots, wooden paddles, lye soap, soaking buckets and drying racks. Add in heavy fabric, unpredictable weather, and the crushing knowledge that nobles expected their linens to look heavenly, despite living in an era where bathing was an occasional hobby, and you begin to understand the daily stress level of the castle's laundry force. First, collecting the mountains of filth, laundry day, which was almost every day, began with collecting dirty items from across the castle. Clothing from nobles and their families, undergarments, yes, even medieval people had those, sheets, blankets, table linens, towels, kitchen-sewered cloths, servants' uniforms. And because people changed clothing far less often back then, laundry was not just dirty, sometimes it was alarming. Sweat stains, wine spills, mud streaks, ink splatters, blood from accidents, usually, and cooking grease were all regular guests on the washing list. Laundry workers approached every pile with the weary optimism of someone who hoped this load might not be horrifying, knowing full well that it absolutely would be. Sorting, a medieval cecil science. Laundry workers didn't simply toss everything together and hope for the best. They sorted meticulously, finer garments in one pile, wool in another, linens here, delicate embroidery there, and heavily soiled rags in a corner, marked for emotional preparation. Different materials required different treatments. A noblewoman's embroidered gown couldn't be beaten against a rock. A kitchen servant's apron, however? Absolutely. Sorting also meant checking pockets and hems for lost items. Laundry workers found everything from coins to notes to small tools to food crumbs that made them question castle dining habits. Occasionally they found love letters, which they absolutely did not read, except they definitely did because medieval gossip sustained entire communities. Soaking, scrubbing, beating, the holy trinity of cleanliness. The washing process began with soaking in large tubs filled with water mixed with lye, a strong caustic substance made from ash. Lye burned skin, dried hands, and stripped natural oils faster than any modern soap, but it removed dirt like nothing else. Laundry workers stirred clothing in these tubs using long sticks, like witches preparing potions against stains rather than spells. After soaking came scrubbing. Workers knelt over washboards or flat stones, rubbing garments back and forth until stains gave up their will to live. They used rough cloths, brushes, and harsh soap blocks. It was back-breaking work, hours spent bent over, arms moving rhythmically, muscles burning. Then came beating. Yes, beating. Laundry workers hauled dripping garments to flat surfaces, or riveted stones and beat them repeatedly with wooden paddles, mallets, or broad clubs. The sound echoed like a drumline of aggression. This wasn't just washing, it was exercise, stress relief, and an aggressive negotiation with dirt. Beating helped loosen fibres, kill pests, and punish unfortunate garments for being filthy in the first place. Boiling, these stayed where clothes could sue for harsh treatment. For especially stubborn items, bed linens, towels, and kitchen cloths, laundry workers heated enormous cauldrons filled with water and soap. They lowered items into the boiling water with long poles, stirring constantly. The steam rose in thick waves, turning the laundry area into a humid bathhouse where nobody was relaxing. Boiling removed odours, softened stains, and had the added benefit of killing whatever tiny horrors lived in castle fabrics. But it was dangerous work. Pots splashed, steam scalded, and workers often ended the day with reddened arms and hair plastered to their faces. Rinsing and wrangling waterlogged fabric. Once washed, garments needed rinsing, sometimes multiple times. Workers wrung out water by twisting fabric with both hands or by wrapping garments around wooden rollers and squeezing them dry with brute force. Fabrics were heavy when dry and outrageously heavy when soaked. Lifting and carrying them required strength that modern gym-goers would admire. A day spent wrangling wet sheets could build biceps capable of snapping stubborn broom handles by accident. Laundry workers were strong, quietly, uncomplainingly, impressively strong. Drying, a battle against weather. Drying laundry was an outdoor event whenever possible. Clotheslines stretched across yards, gardens, or castle walls. Sheets billowed dramatically in the breeze, like flags declaring triumph over filth. But medieval weather was a trickster. Rain appeared suddenly, forcing workers to sprint and rescue garments. Wind knocked linens into mud puddles. Birds targeted fresh sheets with malicious aim. During winter, drying became a nightmare. Laundry froze stiff. Workers had to hang the clothes near hearths, rotating pieces constantly so they didn't scorch. A dropped item meant starting the entire washing process over again. Something no laundry worker ever wanted to happen. Mending. Sewn salvation. Once garments dried, they still weren't finished. Laundry workers also handled mending. Tears, holes, unravelling hems, frayed seams. They patched them all using needles, thread, and skill. A well-mended garment extended its lifespan, which pleased the castle steward and annoyed nobles who wanted excuses for new clothes. Laundry workers stitched with speed and precision. A tear in a noble's sleeve required delicacy. A hole in a servant's tunic required speed. A rip in the lord's underwear required secrecy and a vow not to mention it ever again. By the end of the day, laundry workers were drenched in sweat, steam, soap residue, and fabric water. Their backs ached, their hands were raw, and their clothes were as wet as the items they washed. The good news, they kept the castle dignified and disease-free. The bad news, their own dignity was usually hanging on a line somewhere, waiting to dree. Still, without laundry workers, the castle would have become a scented nightmare. Thanks to them, nobles looked presentable. Servants stayed sanitary, beds remained inviting, and the entire castle smelled just barely acceptable enough to function. If medieval castles had a room dedicated to organised chaos, culinary ambition, and sensory overload, it was the kitchen, and its cooks were the resident sorcerers. These were the men and women who could turn a deer carcass, a questionable cabbage, 3 sacks of grain, and a handful of exotic spices into a dish that made nobles raise their eyebrows in delight instead of suspicion. The cooks didn't just prepare meals, they kept the castle fed, fueled, functioning, and most importantly, alive. A cook's day began before dawn, long before the noble household even considered waking up. While stable hands were tending horses and laundresses were boiling linens, the cooks were already at the fires, coaxing hot flames into obedient cooking tools. Fires, after all, were temperamental. One moment they roared, the next moment they fizzled, especially if a draught snuck in or a scullion added wood with all the subtlety of a siege engine. The morning rush, feeding the castle's many mouths. Cooks prepared breakfast not only for the lord and his family, but also for soldiers, servants, guests, workers, and labour crews. Breakfast might seem simple today, but in a medieval kitchen it involved boiling porridges, baking bread, frying salt pork, warming ale or cider, preparing simple soups, managing leftovers, tasting everything to ensure nothing had quietly gone rancid overnight, and all of this had to be ready at precisely the right time. If breakfast was late, hungry soldiers grew impatient. If the lord's morning meal was cold, someone's career took a dangerous turn, and if the children didn't like their food, they simply staged tiny rebellions that upset everyone. Meal planning, the medieval culinary chess game. Cooks didn't just throw random ingredients together, unless they were making stew, which was medieval cuisine's solution to existential menu crises. They had to plan meals strategically. Seasons dictated which vegetables were available. Storage dictated which ingredients had survived winter. The larder, pantry, and buttery had to be monitored constantly. The cook asked daily questions such as, how many guests are expected? Has the reeve sent up recent livestock counts? Do we still have enough preserved pears? Are the spices locked safely away from thieves with expensive tastes? Did last night's feast decimate the wine barrels? Why does that sack of flour look suspicious? Every meal required mathematics, creativity, and prayer that nobody brought unexpected visitors because surprise guests were culinary emergencies. Spice management, handling the castle's most precious treasures. Spices in medieval Europe were luxury items worth their weight in gold, or at least worth enough that stealing them resulted in punishments involving restitution and public humiliation. Cinnamon, ginger, pepper, saffron, nutmeg, cloves. These were the jewels of the kitchen, kept locked in carved wooden chests or metal containers guarded more carefully than some heirs. The cook held the key. This gave the cook immense power. A good pinch of saffron made a dish glow like sunlight. Too much pepper made a noble gasp for water. Too little seasoning made the lord assume something had gone terribly wrong. Cooks balanced flavours with care. They added spice at precise times, managed supply frugally, and treated every sprinkle of saffron like a sacred ritual, because using too much meant explaining to the steward why the castle spice budget had vanished in a single sauce. Everyday cooking, the backbone of castle life. Daily meals varied depending on class. Nobles demanded variety. Roasted meats, elaborate pastries, fish pies, flavoured soups, seasoned vegetables, glazed fruits. Servants ate simpler dishes, stews, bread, cheese, porridge, boiled vegetables. But cooks oversaw it all. They roasted, boiled, baked, fried, stewed, simmered, chopped, stirred, and improvised constantly. Medieval recipes weren't exact. They were guidelines, vaguely written by someone who apparently assumed everyone knew the proper ratio of a handful to a great handful. Cooks learned through experience, instinct, and trial by fire, sometimes literally. Feasts, the Super Bowl of medieval cooking. When the lord hosted a feast, the kitchen exploded into madness. Cooks became commanders, leading armies of helpers. Scullions chopped vegetables until their fingers went numb. Bakers prepared mountains of bread and pastries. Roasting teams handled spits. Sauces simmered in cauldrons. Tarts were filled, fish gutted, herbs crushed, meat marinated, chickens plucked, pies elaborately decorated with shapes of mythical beasts because nobles liked food that also doubled as storytelling props. Feasts required vast quantities of food. Whole roasted pigs, platters of pheasants, freshwater fish, venison pastries filled with fruit, cheese, sweetened cream soups layered with spices, breads in multiple styles sugared. Treats for dessert. The presentation mattered too. Food had to look impressive, smell exquisite, and arrive to the hall in proper order. Cooks coordinated timing like military generals, too early and dishes cooled, too late and nobles turned cranky, in the medieval sense, which involved guilting servants publicly. Avoiding accidental poisoning, the silent struggle. Cooks knew that spoiled food could kill just as effectively as poisoned wine. With no refrigeration, risk lurked everywhere. Meat had to be salted, cured, smoked, or cooked immediately. Dairy spoiled quickly. Fish went bad faster than gossip. Bread moulded. Vegetables rotted quietly in corners. Cooks sniffed, poked, tasted, and inspected everything. They trusted their senses, experience, and a healthy dose of paranoia. A cook's failure meant illness sweeping through the castle. A medieval illness was no small inconvenience. Their vigilance prevented outbreaks, stomach disasters, and the embarrassment of serving a dish that fought back. Stress, skill, and culinary diplomacy. The kitchen was loud, hot, and relentlessly busy. Fires roared, pots boiled, steam clouded the air. Workers shouted across the chaos. Cooks stood in the centre, commanding every detail while being blamed for every mishap. A dish too salty? The cook's fault. A dish too bland? The cook's fault. A noble's bad mood? Absolutely the cook's fault. Yet cooks held prestige. Their hands brought comfort to the entire castle. Their art impressed visitors. Their skill kept morale high. Their food sustained armies, eased tensions, soothed sickbeds, and made celebrations unforgettable. At night, cooks retired exhausted, smelling like smoke, meat, and onions, knowing they had fed an entire medieval world. The good news, without cooks, the castle wouldn't last 3 days. The bad news, they knew it, and so did everyone else. If medieval castles had 2 fuels, one for the body, one for the soul, they were bread and ale. Bread fed everyone, from nobles to stable hands. Ale kept people hydrated, happy and blissfully unaware that drinking river water was basically signing up for a personal feud with bacteria. The brewer and baker were the quiet architects of medieval survival, comfort, and public morale. Without them, the entire castle would collapse into hunger-driven chaos in 24 hours flat. Unlike the cooks, who presided over kitchens of noise and heat, brewers and bakers worked in their own specialised domains. Their spaces were temples of transformation, where grain became dough, dough became bread, and barley mash became liquid cheerfulness. Together, they kept the castle's stomachs full, its workers energised, and its mood significantly less murderous. The brewer, the castle's hydration department. If you lived in a medieval castle and wanted something safe to drink, you had 2 options, ale or more ale. Water was unpredictable, often contaminated by livestock runoff, sewage, swampy sources, or surprises upstream. Ale, however, was boiled during brewing, flavoured with herbs or hops, and kept in sealed barrels, making it far safer than anything flowing naturally. The brewer's work began with grain selection. Barley was most common, but oats, wheat, or rye could appear depending on availability and budget. The grains were soaked to soften them, then dried in kilns that filled the brewhouse with a warm, toasty scent, comforting unless you'd been breathing it non-stop for 9 hours. Next came malting and mashing. The brewer cracked the grains, mixed them with hot water, and created a thick mash that looked like a combination of porridge and mud, but smelled considerably nicer. This mash was stirred in massive kettles so large they could hide several disgruntled scullions. Stirring was serious business. If the mash burned, the flavour went wrong, and nobles would complain loudly, as if their lives depended on tasting no char whatsoever. The resulting liquid wort was siphoned off, boiled again, and flavoured. Hops weren't universal in the early medieval period. Sometimes herbs like yarrow or rosemary were used, creating ales that tasted adventurous, surprising, or suspicious depending on the day. Then came fermentation, the brewer's most unpredictable phase. Yeast, whether added intentionally or drifting in as a freeloading guest, transformed the wort into ale. The brewer monitored the barrels daily, reading bubbles like fortune-tellers read tea leaves. Too slow, the ale went weak. Too fast, it turned strange. Too warm, sour. Too cold, lifeless. The brewer hovered over fermentation like an anxious parent, tapping barrels, adjusting temperatures, and muttering prayers to saints who probably had better things to do. Storage required a keen mind. Barrels needed sealing, rotating, patching, and defending from thirsty soldiers who believed that checking the ale quality was a perfectly valid reason to siphon off half a pint. Finally, the ale was ready. Mild, safe, refreshing, and consumed by nearly everyone daily. It accompanied meals, fueled labourers, soothed tense meetings, and prevented the castle from dehydrating into a bitter, thirsty mess. The good news? A successful brew earned praise and gratitude. The bad news? A failed brew earned nationwide complaints from everyone with a mouth. The baker, master of the medieval daily miracle bread, was the backbone of the castle diet, served with breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, feasts, and emergencies. Quick, grab something to eat before the Lord begins talking again. The baker's responsibility was monumental. Produce enough bread to feed hundreds of people every single day, without ever running out. Their day began absurdly early, long before sunrise. Flour dust hung in the air like snow. Dough troughs lined the room. The baker wiped flour from their face within 10 minutes of arriving, a gesture repeated at least 60 more times throughout the day. Grinding and measuring flour came from the castle's mill, but it wasn't consistent. Sometimes it was fine and soft. Other times it was coarse enough to exfoliate a person accidentally. Bakers sifted, measured, mixed, and adjusted ratios with practiced instinct. Too wet a dough produced flat loaves. Too dry a dough produced brick-like weapons that could double as mace heads. Kneading, the medieval upper body workout. Kneading dough in large quantities was not gentle or poetic activity. It was physical power, repeated motion, stubborn muscle work. Bakers pushed, folded, punched, rolled and stretched dough until it responded like a well-trained soldier. Sweat dripped. Arms ached. The dough resisted, absorbed and transformed under hands that knew exactly how to tame it. Shaping and rising. Loaves came in shapes. Large round balls for noble tables, long flat loaves for soldiers, finger-sized rolls for guests, sturdy brown loaves for servants. The baker arranged them on wooden boards, covered them with cloth, and watched carefully as they rose near the warm ovens. Temperature was everything. Too much heat. The dough rose too fast and collapsed. Too little. It sat stubbornly, refusing to grow, like a child ignoring chores. The oven. A dragon the baker controlled. The castle oven was a monstrous stone chamber heated by burning huge quantities of wood. The baker had to preheat it properly, sweep out the embers, and place loaves inside with long paddles. Baking times weren't measured with clocks, they were judged by experience. The sound of dough hitting the oven, the colour of the crust, the smell rising in waves. The baker's internal sense of timing. A perfectly baked loaf made the kitchen smell heavenly. An overbaked loaf made the kitchen smell like someone had sinned. Bread as politics, bread was also political. Nobles ate fine white bread made from sifted flour. Servants got darker, denser grain loaves. Soldiers ate hearty breads that stayed fresh longer. Distributing bread was its own delicate system. If the baker accidentally shorted a barracks or sent the wrong bread to the wrong table, the complaints piled up instantly. Bread shortages were the ultimate nightmare. Hunger could start fights. Hunger could create mutiny. Hunger could make servants consider rebellion. Bakers prevented all of that with precise planning and enough loaves to feed a small army, because they were feeding a small army. The tandem work of brewer and baker. Although separate jobs, brewers and bakers often worked in harmony. Both relied heavily on grain. Both understood fermentation, one for drink, one for dough. Both managed supplies and timing. Both woke early and finished late. Both were essential to the castle's morale. When ale was good and bread was plentiful, the castle felt safe, prosperous, and satisfied. When either failed, everyone noticed immediately and loudly. The good news, bakers and brewers kept peace in the castle. The bad news, peace required endless kneading, boiling, stirring, sweating, and hoping nothing went wrong with grain this year. If medieval castles had a lifeline, a nervous system connecting them to the outside world, it was the messengers. These were the human lightning bolts of the Middle Ages. Fast, determined, suspiciously durable individuals hired to carry letters, orders, warnings, and urgent news across landscapes that looked like they had been designed specifically to cause travel-related misery. In an era without phones, radios, newspapers, or even reliable maps, the messenger kept communication flowing, kingdoms functioning, and misunderstandings from erupting into full-scale wars most of the time. A messenger's workday began with someone shouting, "This must reach the next castle immediately," and thrusting a letter, scroll or sealed packet into their hands. Messengers rarely knew what was inside, they just knew it was important enough that they'd be blamed if anything happened to it. No pressure, the message itself could be anything. A royal command, a treaty update, a tax report, an urgent request for reinforcements, a warning about raiders, a political marriage proposal, or even a noble's passive-aggressive note like, "I expect better quality wine at the next feast." Regardless of content, once the wax seal was applied, the messenger became its temporary guardian angel. Before setting out, the messenger armed themselves with essentials: a sturdy cloak, a travel bag, riding boots, a dagger for self-defense or opening stubborn letters, food rations, a water skins, and a small purse to pay tolls, ferrymen, or anyone who looked threatening and open to negotiation. Mounted messengers had horses, fast, lean animals trained for endurance rather than elegance. On foot, messengers depended on their legs, lungs, and the quiet terror that if they didn't make it by sundown, they'd be reprimanded by someone whose voice carried the fury of administrative disappointment. Once on the road, messengers entered a world filled with mud, rain, snow, wind, potholes, flooded paths, fallen knock-on trees, territorial goats, suspicious strangers, and the occasional wolf pack that looked like it was having a bad day. If the weather turned against them, and medieval weather always turned against them, they wrapped their cloaks tighter, muttered curses, and pressed on. Deadlines didn't care about storms. Bandits, unfortunately, did. Messengers were prime targets, alone, fast-moving, and visibly carrying valuables, or so bandits assumed. Many messengers developed offensive skills, quick thinking, evasive maneuvers, shortcut knowledge, and the ability to detect ambushes by noticing subtle signs like an unnatural quiet or a rustling bush that suspiciously resembled a man in a bush costume. To avoid danger, messengers often relied on speed, stealth, and local knowledge. They memorized safe routes, river crossings, villages, shelter points, and places where the locals wouldn't rob them. If they needed to sleep, they found monasteries, inns, barns, or even sympathetic farmhouses, making sure their messages stayed dry, hidden, and secure. Nothing destroyed a messenger's credibility faster than arriving with a letter that smelled like sheep. Some carried wax tablets or draft scrolls for taking notes along the way, records of who they'd passed, warnings they'd heard, or updates they needed to send back. Their job wasn't just physical, it was informational. They listened, observed, and sometimes became the castle's best source of news about distant markets, roads, political shifts, and rumours. Messengers were also masters of time management. Moving between castles, towns, and outposts required calculating distances, judging travel speed, pacing the horse, and adjusting routes on the fly. A flooded river meant rerouting. A broken bridge meant doubling back. A warband crossing the road meant hiding in a ditch and reconsidering all life decisions. When travelling for diplomacy, messengers entered court halls where pomp, etiquette, and suspicious glances abounded. They bowed, presented sealed letters, and endured interrogation from gatekeepers, guards, or scribes. Messengers became experts at saying, "I am simply delivering the message," which was medieval code for, "Do not blame me for whatever political crisis this scroll contains." Returning home wasn't a leisurely ride either. They often carried replies, just as important and just as urgent. And sometimes there was no reply, just a vague instruction like, "Return with all haste." This translated to, "Ride faster than logic allows and pray your horse doesn't quit on you halfway." Despite their exhausting lifestyle, messengers developed deep familiarity with the landscape. They knew where wolves nested, where marshes hid behind innocent-looking grass, which taverns served drinkable ale, which ferries operated in winter, and which narrow paths allowed them to outrun bandits convinced they were carrying treasure maps. The role required stamina. A messenger could ride 50 miles in a day if needed, swapping horses when possible. On foot, they moved swiftly, pacing themselves like marathoners, stopping only to drink, adjust their gear, or glare at the sky. for sending yet another rainstorm. Even inside the castle, messengers rarely rested. They delivered news internally from the lord to the steward, from the reeve to the armoury, from the cellar to the chapel. They carried notes between officers, errands across courtyards, and occasionally were asked to transport messages that everyone involved pretended were diplomatic, but were actually gossip with wax seals. Messengers earned respect for their reliability, courage, and endurance. But they were also blamed more than anyone else for delays they couldn't control. Snowstorm? Messenger's fault. River flooded? Messenger's fault. Bridge eaten by termites? Somehow still the messenger's fault. The good news? A skilled messenger was vital, trusted, and valued. The bad news? They spent most of their life damp, exhausted, and being chased by animals or deadlines. Yet they kept going, one message, 1 mile, one dangerous road at a time, connecting castles, kingdoms, and a people who would be utterly lost without them. If the blacksmith provided the castle's sound effects, and the cooks handled the aroma department, the minstrels and heralds were responsible for everything that made castle life feel alive. The music, the drama, the announcements, the ceremonial flair, and the gossip that slipped through the air like smoke. Where soldiers brought discipline and clerks brought order, minstrels and heralds brought vibe. These were the performers, the storytellers, the news shouters, the melody makers. The medieval equivalents of a podcast, radio station, marching band, public address system, wedding DJ, motivational speaker, and town gossip hotline all rolled into one. The minstrels, music makers, mood shapers, and narrative architects. Minstrels were the castle's full-time entertainers, though entertainer hardly captures their multitasking existence. They sang, played instruments, recited epics, dramatised tales, wrote verses on command, and transformed the dining hall into a theatre of imagination. Their craft was essential in a world where silence meant only 2 things, fear or boredom, and boredom was unacceptable in a noble household that lived for spectacle. A minstrel's day began with tuning instruments, lutes, harps, psalteries, flutes, bagpipes, or anything that could emit pleasant sound once in a while. Strings snapped, reeds cracked, tuning pegs protested, and minstrels muttered threats at their instruments like exasperated parents. Once everything was tuned, or acceptably less detuned, they practiced songs, refined verses, and occasionally rehearsed entire epics because nobles never said sing something short. No, they said perform the tale of King so-and-so, which took anywhere from 20 minutes to 4 hours. Minstrels performed for dinners, feasts, visiting dignitaries, small gatherings, celebrations, quiet afternoons, awkward silences, whenever the lord dramatically announced, "Play something to lighten the mood." Their music shaped atmosphere. Lively tunes fueled drinking halls. Soft melodies soothed tempers after political squabbles. Dramatic songs set the mood for storytelling nights. And every minstrel knew which noble preferred what, who liked ballads, who enjoyed romances, who wanted battle songs, and who insisted on cheerful tunes because anything sad made them reflect too deeply. But music was only half their job. Storytelling was the other. Minstrels were oral historians and imagination engines, weaving tales of legendary heroes, noble ancestors, faraway wonders, tragic romances, magical beasts, and occasionally thinly veiled satire about people in the room. They memorized thousands of lines, poetry, jokes, lessons, anecdotes, becoming walking libraries powered by rhythm and breath. And yes, minstrels were also gossip carriers. Officially, they travelled from castle to castle spreading culture. Unofficially, they absolutely spread rumours, scandals, news, hints, predictions, and the occasional creative exaggeration that made their performances more interesting. They knew which lord quarrelled with which neighbour, who built a new hall, who bought expensive horses, who had embarrassing hunting accidents, and which noble families' internal problems were too juicy not to share. When minstrels arrived in new courts, nobles greeted them not just with hospitality but with curiosity. What stories do you bring from afar? Translation: tell us everything we're not supposed to know. Heralds: the castle's official voices. If minstrels represented entertainment, heralds represented authority. Heralds were the loudspeakers of the medieval world, men with booming voices, impeccable memory, flawless presentation, and the confidence of someone who announced things for a living. Heralds made official proclamations. They stood in courtyards, squares, markets, or castle halls and shouted. New laws, tax notices, feast announcements, tournament invitations, diplomatic messages, war declarations, guest arrivals, schedule changes, anything the Lord wanted publicly known. Their voices had to cut through wind, chatter, livestock, noises, and general medieval chaos. Many heralds trained their vocal strength like athletes, practicing breath control, projection, pacing, and dramatic timing until they could shout a clear announcement from one end of the bailey to the other. Heralds also served crucial roles in ceremony. They introduced guests during formal banquets, read titles aloud, announced knightly achievements, declared tournament results, and narrated jousting matches with theatrical excitement. A herald made events grand. They turned a simple dinner into a formal occasion, a joust into a spectacle, and a visiting merchant into Sir Edmund of the unpronounceable village. They were the keepers of heraldry too, the science, and sometimes chaos, of coats of arms. A herald needed to recognise banners, crests, badges, symbols, and family colours instantly. In battle, they identified friends and foes by the designs on shields and surcoats. In tournaments, they ensured no knight used another's emblem. In diplomacy, they knew exactly which patterns could offend which noble family. In other words, heralds were medieval brand managers with better cloaks. Morale boosting, the heart behind the noise. Both minstrels and heralds played enormous roles in maintaining morale, something the castle desperately needed after long winters, failed harvests, tense political moments, or military campaigns. Minstrels roused spirits with a clever joke or an uplifting song. Heralds elevated pride by recognizing accomplishments or delivering good news with practiced flourish. During gloomy evenings, sleepless nights, or anxious waiting periods, minstrels told tales of hope, glory, and triumph. During celebrations, heralds announced victories and praised the people who earned them. Together they shaped mood, softened hardships, and made the castle feel connected. The human side of performance. Despite their prestige, the work was demanding. Minstrels developed calloused fingers, tired voices, mental fatigue from memorizing endless lines, and the constant pressure to impress. Heralds faced sore throats, weather-beaten faces, and the expectation to maintain perfect posture and clarity even during storms, crowded markets, or chaotic feast halls. But they were respected. Guests sought them out. Lords rewarded them generously. Children adored them, servants admired them, and travellers recognised them as the heartbeat of storytelling and ceremony. The good news? They brought joy, meaning, and colour to castle life. The bad news? If they performed badly, the entire hall noticed, and nobles never forgot. If the castle was a body, the chapel was its soul, a place where people confessed sins, sought hope, begged for blessings, and, occasionally, prayed very hard that the Lord wouldn't notice missing tax grain. But behind every moment of medieval piety was a dedicated team of chapel staff who kept the spiritual engine running. These were the priests, acolytes, choir singers, caretakers, and candle wranglers who ensured the castle stayed on speaking terms with heaven. Unlike the bustling kitchen or the noisy forge, the chapel operated with a solemn rhythm. Yet beneath the quiet, the work never stopped. Medieval religious life was a full-time job, and not just on Sundays. The priest, the castle's spiritual anchorman. The priest was the highest spiritual authority within the castle walls, and his responsibilities ranged from daily mass to pastoral counselling to the delicate art of telling nobles they were sinning without getting fired. He worked out of the chapel's dim interior, All carved stone, flickering candles, incense smoke, and the soft echoes of whispered prayers. His day began early. Before breakfast was served anywhere else in the castle, the priest was already at the altar, preparing for morning mass. He laid out vestments, arranged the chalice, checked the missal, and mentally prepared to shepherd a congregation that ranged from devout nobles to sleepy soldiers who only came because attendance was compulsory. Mass itself was a display of ritual precision, chanting prayers, lifting the host, reading scripture, giving blessings. But after the congregation dispersed, the priest's real work continued behind the scenes. He visited the sick, listened to confessions, mediated disputes, performed baptisms, blessed new constructions, scribbled in parish registers, copied prayers, and responded to endless spiritual questions such as, "Is my sheep possessed? If lightning struck the barn, is God angry? If my child won't stop yelling, is that the devil or just normal?" He handled every question with patience, or at least the appearance of it. Acolytes, the holy assistants with endless chores. Acolytes were the priest's helpers, young boys or servants who performed essential tasks that looked simple but required constant attention. They lit candles, so many candles, carried incense, fetched holy water, set up the altar, rang bells at precise moments, and made sure the chapel looked tidy enough that visiting clergy wouldn't gasp in horror. Candle maintenance alone could fill a day. Wax dripped everywhere, on benches, stone floors, choir stalls and acolytes' fingers. Wicks needed trimming, candles needed replacing, soot needed cleaning. During winter, drafts blew out flames constantly, turning acolytes into frantic sprinters charging down aisles with flint and steel. They also memorized cues, when to step forward with the cross, when to swing the censer, when to respond loudly, when to respond softly, and most importantly, when to avoid tripping over their robes while carrying sacred objects. The choir, medieval mood technicians. Choir singers, usually boys or trained adults, provided the soundtrack to worship. Their chants, hymns, and polyphonic harmonies filled the chapel with emotion. Music elevated the spiritual atmosphere, soothed the worried, comforted the grieving, and impressed guests who judged every detail of a noble household. Choir practice happened daily. Voices cracked, notes missed, harmonies collapsed. Yet the choirmaster pushed them relentlessly because feast days demanded flawless performances that could last hours. High holy days meant elaborate, layered singing requiring discipline, stamina, and the ability to breathe without collapsing on the stone floor. Choir members also studied Latin by rote, even if they didn't fully understand it. Their pronunciation had to sound correct enough to pass inspection by visiting bishops. Relics, the chapel's most valuable treasures. Many castle chapels housed relics, bones or items associated with saints. These were believed to protect the castle, bring blessings, and attract pilgrims. Relics needed guarding, cleaning carefully, documenting and presenting during ceremonies. The priest handled relics with reverence. Acolytes handled them with fear, because dropping one was the medieval spiritual equivalent of dropping a royal crown into a privy. Relics were kept in ornate reliquaries. Gold, silver, carved wood, cleaned regularly, inspected for dust, and locked away when not on display. Confession and counselling, spiritual crisis management. Confession was a core part of chapel duty. Servants confessed small misdeeds, soldiers confessed big ones, nobles confessed selectively. The priest heard it all while maintaining a serene expression that implied none of the confessions were shocking, even when they absolutely were. He also gave advice, marital advice, moral advice, agricultural advice, pray over your crops, medical advice, have you tried praying harder, and political advice delivered it with extreme caution so as not to offend anyone important. People looked to him for guidance in every aspect of life. Ceremonies, the chapel's biggest events. Chapel staff coordinated baptisms, weddings, funerals, saints' day masses, blessings, feast day processions, and emergency rituals during storms or plagues. Each ceremony required preparation, special vestments, extra candles, decorated altars, music rehearsals, holy water jugs, filled incense burning just smoky enough to feel holy, but not enough to make nobles cough. They also organised seasonal rituals, Advent, Lent, Easter, Christmas, each with its own complex calendar, readings and ceremonial elements. Sometimes they spent more time preparing rituals than performing them. Chapel care and maintenance. The chapel required constant upkeep. Stone floors had to be swept, wooden benches polished, altar cloths washed, brass candlesticks buffed, prayer books repaired, dust removed from crevices that seemed designed to collect dust. Acolytes did much of the heavy lifting, sometimes grumbling quietly, till the priest reminded them that humility was a virtue. The quiet power of chapel staff. Though they weren't warriors, administrators or craftsmen, chapel workers held real influence. They taught values, shaped behaviour, and reminded everyone that life was more than work, war and meals. Their presence provided moral stability, spiritual reassurance, and the unspoken comfort that someone was praying for the castle's safety. But their job was demanding. Early mornings, late nights, constant responsibilities, and the never-ending requirement to look calm, holy, and collected, even when a candle collapsed, or a choir boy fainted mid-hymn. The good news? They kept the castle spiritually grounded. The bad news? They also kept burning their own fingers on candle wax. If the castle were a company, the ladies' maids and valets would be the executive personal assistants whose job description was simply handle everything the noble can't, won't, or has never considered doing. These attendants were the invisible engines behind noble elegance, the hands that dressed, polished, arranged, stitched, scrubbed and scented and organised every detail of their employers' lives. Without them, the noble household would collapse under tangled hair, wrinkled linens, and clothing emergencies capable of starting diplomatic incidents. Ladies' maids and valets lived close to their employers, physically and always metaphorically. Their rooms were often positioned near the noble chambers, so they could answer nighttime calls, dawn preparations, and sudden crises. "Where is my green tunic?" "No, not that green tunic, the other one." Privacy was a luxury the attendants rarely enjoyed. Their entire world revolved around anticipation, readiness, and the eternal goal of making aristocrats look effortlessly magnificent. Morning ritual, the daily transformation. Before the noble household woke, their attendants were already moving through quiet halls, preparing clothing, heating water, gathering combs and brushes, and choosing accessories. When the noble finally stirred, the attendant entered the chamber with the practiced calm of someone who had watched this waking routine countless times and memorized every preference. Ladies' maids brushed and styled hair, braids, curls, coils, ribbons, and veils arranged with delicate fingers that had mastered the art of not pulling too hard unless the lady deserved it. They helped with cosmetics, powders, tinted balms, perfumes, rosewater, and herbal washes that promised beauty, youthfulness, or at least pleasant camouflage. They dressed their lady layer by layer, chemise, shift, stockings, bodice, gown, laces, clasps, jewellery, ensuring nothing pinched, sagged, wrinkled, or clashed with the noble family's image. Valets handled the gentlemen. They trimmed beards, combed hair, polished boots, buckled belts, tied laces, fastened doublets, inspected seams, and ensured everything fit perfectly. They assisted their lords with undergarments, yes, nobles wore them, outer garments, cloaks, gloves, and sometimes the daily addition of scented oils designed to mask the medieval "I haven't bathed this week" reality. Every garment had meaning, every accessory signalled rank. Every morning was a miniature ceremony, and ladies' maids and valets choreographed it to perfection. Dressing right, fashion as warfare. Clothing was power. Wearing the wrong colours insulted allies. Wearing outdated styles made nobles look foolish. Wearing fabric too fine for one's rank could spark rumours, so attendants became fashion strategists. They knew which gowns flattered their lady's complexion. They knew which tunics their lord hated. They knew how to disguise weight gain, aging, or the unfortunate effects of late-night feasting. They curated fabrics, paired garments, selected jewellery, and sometimes hid stains with the skill of miracle workers. Attendants were experts at patching tears invisibly tightening, laces discreetly hiding embroidery, mistakes smoothing stubborn creases, pinning veils in ways that defied gravity, folding garments with military precision, dealing with nobles who said things like, "I want to wear the blue one, but not that blue one." Bath. Preparation. Medieval spa management. Bathing was not daily, but when it happened, it was an event. Attendants prepared the tub, hauled water, heated it, scented it with herbs, petals or oils, and ensured the temperature didn't drop mid-bath. They arranged towels, combs, soaps, and sometimes stood near enough to assist without making the situation awkward. If a noble wanted a bath at an inconvenient hour, late at night, after a feast, immediately before a critical meeting, the attendant simply obeyed, suppressing any internal screaming. Laundry and garment care. At the noble level. While laundry workers handled general washing, personal attendants managed the noble's delicate garments. Fine linens, embroidered gowns, silk mantles, fur-trimmed cloaks, elaborate hats, lacework undergarments requiring secrecy, jewellery storage. They removed stains using lemon, vinegar, chalk, stale breadcrumbs, yes, really, or other home remedies. They brushed velvets, fluffed furs, replaced laces, and sewed tiers with stitches so small they looked like magic. A noble's wardrobe was a walking display of wealth, and one tiny flaw could become the castle's favourite joke for months. Social duties, the psychology portion of the job. Personal attendants also served as confidants, or at the very least, as the people nobles talked at. They listened quietly while their employers complained, plotted, gossiped, panicked, or practiced speeches. They comforted them after arguments, encouraged them before events, and sometimes absorbed emotional storms the way shields absorb arrows. But they also managed household diplomacy. A lady's maid might subtly warn her lady not to wear a gown that would offend a visiting duchess. A valet might gently suggest his lord avoid making bold fashion statements during a tense political meeting. They were emotional stabilizers, etiquette advisors, wardrobe managers, and amateur therapists rolled into one. Event preparation, stage crew for noble life, for feasts, ceremonies, hunts, diplomatic meetings or celebrations, attendants prepared their nobles with perfectionist energy. They dressed them in specific clothing for the occasion, styled hair appropriately, polished shoes to reflect torchlight perfectly, and ensured jewellery sparkled at maximum political impact. They waited nearby during events, ready to adjust garments, fetch items, or whisper discreet reminders like, "My lady, your veil is slipping," or "My lord, that is not the duke you just greeted. That is the duke's annoyed brother." Discretion, the most important skill. Ladies, maids, and valets knew everything. They saw secrets. They overheard whispers. They noticed hidden letters, secret trysts, private arguments, and suspicious stains. Their silence was essential. Breaking trust could ruin their employers and their own lives. The good ones mastered the art of knowing everything while pretending to know nothing. Life behind the elegance. Despite their proximity to luxury, the job was exhausting. Long hours, late nights, early mornings, heavy workloads, demanding nobles, emotional labour, and constant vigilance defined their lives. But they gained trust, status, privileges, better quarters, and sometimes lifelong loyalty from their noble families. The good news, they stood beside power, influence, and beauty every day. The bad news, they were expected to maintain all three flawlessly without ever showing exhaustion. If the castle was a grand machine with thousands of moving parts, The chamberlain was the person who knew where every gear fit, where every bolt belonged, and which gear would fly off first if someone didn't intervene. He was the supreme administrator of indoor order, the master of rooms, keys, storage, valuables, guest arrangements, and logistical puzzles that made castle life feel structured instead of chaotic. If the castellan handled the big-picture operations of the fortress, the chamberlain handled the human civilization that happened inside it. His world consisted of corridors, chests, linens, storerooms, chamber inventories, guest lists, and a ring of keys so large it could double as a small weapon. The chamberlain was the quiet force that ensured nobles never entered a room filled with yesterday's clutter. Guests never slept in the wrong bed, and visiting dignitaries never discovered that the castle occasionally misplaced furniture. The master of rooms chamberlains oversaw every private and semi-private space in the castle. Bedrooms, guest chambers, solar rooms, retiring rooms, meeting chambers, storage chambers, and the noble family's personal living areas. They knew which beds needed new straw mattresses, which chambers needed sweeping, which tapestries needed mending, which rooms required fresh linens, which cushions were lumpy enough to insult a noble's backside, which doors squeaked at night and disturbed sleep, which window shutters were broken again. He coordinated the cleaning staff, ensuring every room was presentable. This wasn't simple dusting. A noble chamber required perfection: polished floors, smooth sheets, neatly arranged furniture, warmed blankets in winter, and everything placed precisely where the noble liked it. A chamberlain didn't just maintain rooms, he curated ambience. Keys, his power and his burden. The chamberlain's great symbol of authority was the key ring, heavy, loud, and filled with keys to every important door in the household. Storerooms, armories, guest chests, linen cupboards, wine cellars, and most importantly, the rooms where valuables were stored. People respected the chamberlain because of the keys. They also feared him for the same reason. He knew what was locked away and what wasn't. He tracked which keys were used when, who borrowed them, and why. Losing a key wasn't a minor mistake, it was a catastrophe. It meant locks needed replacing, schedules disrupted, and trust shattered. The chamberlain slept lightly, partly because of duty and partly because keys pressing into your ribs all night were their own form of insomnia. Storage, where organisation became a lifestyle. Castles held vast collections of things: linens, candles, tapestries, rugs, cushions, spare garments, festival decorations, tableware, furniture parts, writing supplies, winter coverings, seasonal bedding, imported luxury items, and a startling amount of items nobody remembered storing but everyone swore were essential. The chamberlain maintained detailed inventories of it all, not by using spreadsheets or clipboards, but by keeping mental maps, personal notes and annotated lists scratched into ledgers with quill and ink. He knew exactly how many. Blankets the castle owned, ewers and basins were stored, candles remained for winter, tablecloths were clean, bed coverings were repaired, chests were full, imported rugs were available for impressing guests, and heaven help the servant who misplaced a silver cup or a decorative table runner. The chamberlain noticed everything. Valuables, the castle's trustworthy vault keeper. The chamberlain was responsible for safeguarding the noble family's valuables: jewellery, fine garments, coins, ceremonial objects, precious heirlooms, and diplomatic gifts. These items weren't just stored, they were cared for, polished, wrapped, locked, inspected, and logged. If a noble asked, "Where is my emerald brooch with the golden falcon?" the chamberlain answered instantly, "Upper chamber chest, second shelf, left corner, and beneath the velvet pouch." Losing or misplacing noble valuables was not an option. The chamberlain's reputation depended on accuracy. This required vigilance, precision, and a commitment to honesty, or at least a commitment to never letting anything leave the storerooms without accountability. Guest accommodations, the medieval hotel manager. Hosting guests was one of the chamberlain's most exhausting duties. Nobles rarely travelled light. They arrived with entourages, luggage, expectations, and a tendency to judge every detail. The chamberlain assigned rooms, arranged furnishings, laid fresh sheets, prepared washing basins, and ensured that each guest's quarters matched their rank. He balanced hierarchy with available space, making sure the important guest didn't feel insulted and the less important guest didn't feel humiliated. He coordinated where attendants slept, where horses' gear was stored, how luggage was arranged, which rooms required fireplaces, lit which rooms needed privacy, which rooms required distancing because the guests disliked one another. A chamberlain understood noble egos as well as any diplomat. Daily logistics, the king of scheduling everything indoors. While the steward oversaw finances and the castellan managed military readiness, the chamberlain controlled daily comforts. He managed room rotations, seasonal furniture, changes, linen cycles, bath preparation, coordination, special room requests. The Duchess requires more pillows immediately. Meal send-ups for nobles who refuse to eat in the hall, quiet hours, lighting arrangements, evening bed-warming procedures, emergency room reassignment when someone fainted dramatically. He also communicated constantly with other departments, kitchen, laundry, valets, servants, ensuring everyone worked in sync. If the chamberlain failed at coordination, the entire household felt it instantly. The psychology of service. The chamberlain interacted with nobles daily. He was expected to read moods, anticipate preferences, foresee discomfort, solve problems, discreetly keep secrets, maintain absolute politeness. He was present for private conversations, emotional breakdowns, dressing crises, guest tantrums and arguments murmured behind closed doors. He learned to remain invisible when needed, and indispensable when summoned. A job of quiet power. Despite the stress, the chamberlain held real influence. He controlled access to private rooms, knowledge of household workings, and the inner comfort of the noble family. Noble guests often respected him more than younger lords. Servants obeyed him. The noble family trusted him. But the labour was endless. The castle never slept. And neither, it seemed, did the chamberlain. Not truly. His work followed him everywhere, a constant hum beneath castle life. The good news, he kept the noble household functioning with clockwork precision. The bad news, if a single pillow was out of place, he heard about it immediately. If you walked through a medieval castle and felt a sudden urge to behave yourself, thank the Guardsmen. These were the upright figures stationed at gates, corridors, staircases, battlements, and every location where trouble might happen, or where someone higher up simply thought trouble looked possible. Armed, vigilant, and often bored enough to recite the entire inventory of the armory from memory, Guardsmen were the castle's living security system. They didn't have alarms or cameras, but they had eyes, ears, spears, and the ability to glare hard enough to make suspicious individuals rethink all their life choices. A guard's day began early, with the changing of the night watch. As dawn's grey light crept over the battlements, the day shift assembled, rubbing sleep from their eyes while listening to reports from their nocturnal colleagues. Nothing happened. Everything was fine. We heard a fox scream and thought it was the apocalypse for a minute, but then it wasn't. Thus reassured, the guardsmen began their routine. Standing. Watch. The art of looking. Imposing for hours. Most guards spent long stretches stationed at a single post. Gatehouses, outer doors, courtyard entrances, great hall thresholds, staircases leading to noble chambers, or the corridors where important rooms lay. They were expected to stand still, stay alert, and project authority, even when nothing more exciting than a passing servant occurred for 2 solid hours. Standing guard required an odd combination of physical endurance and mental discipline. Legs went numb, feet ached, helmets weighed heavily on heads. Sun glared directly into faces during summer. During winter, wind stabbed them like ice daggers, and all the while they needed to appear as sharp and ready, as if an enemy army sat outside the gates instead of 2 chickens and a bored cat. But the uniform helped. Whether clad in chainmail, padded gambeson, or a livery surcoat bearing the Lord's emblem, Guardsmen were instantly recognisable. Their polished weapons, spears, halberds, or occasionally swords sent an unmistakable message. Do not test us, we are tired. We will enforce the rules. Perimeter defence, the castle's first line of not today. Outside their static posts, guards patrolled the outer walls and courtyards, checking for anything suspicious, a cart left unattended, a stranger wandering without purpose, a loose door latch, a servant carrying something too heavy to be normal, a messenger looking confused enough to raise concern, a noble's pet wandering where it absolutely shouldn't be. They monitored the comings and goings at the gates, merchants delivering food, blacksmiths arriving with tools, visitors seeking entry, peasants bringing dues, soldiers returning from training. Their eyes flicked constantly from faces to hands to bags to horses to carts, searching for anomalies. If someone arrived without proper authorization, the guardsmen questioned them, sent for verification, or simply refused entry with the confidence of men who knew they were the final word, at least until their captain showed up. Law enforcement, the castle's internal police force. Inside the walls, guardsmen acted as lawkeepers. They stopped fights between servants, escorted troublemakers to holding cells, mediated disputes, and handled petty crimes such as theft, drunkenness, disorderly conduct, breaking curfew, unauthorized crossbow usage, more common than one would think. They patrolled evening corridors, checking that torches were lit, doors locked, and nobody suspicious lurked where they shouldn't. If someone screamed, shouted, or ran down a hallway after dark, the guards arrived fast, partly to protect the household, partly because it meant something interesting was finally happening. When nobles hosted feasts or gatherings, guards stood at entry points to ensure uninvited individuals didn't slip in. Because if there was one universal truth across all centuries, it's that people love sneaking into parties with free food. Crowd control, a skill nobody talks about. During festivals, fairs, announcements, executions, proclamations, or spontaneous castle drama, guardsmen maintained order. They formed lines, blocked off areas, ushered people into designated spaces, and occasionally carried away individuals who absolutely insisted they weren't drunk, but absolutely were. Crowd control required tact, patience, and the ability to use a halberd more as a guiding stick than a stabbing device. Ceremonial duties, looking fancy but still dangerous. Guardsmen didn't just keep order, they also provided pageantry. During noble entrances, weddings, religious processions, feast day ceremonies, and diplomatic receptions, guards lined halls, flanked doors, and stood as living symbols of the Lord's authority. Their armour gleamed, their posture straightened, their bows were perfectly synchronised. Their faces remained stoic enough to hide the fact that their armour pinched, or that they hadn't blinked in a full minute. In these moments, the role wasn't about force. It was about presence, impressing guests, projecting power, maintaining dignity, and escort service, not the fun kind. Guardsmen frequently escorted important individuals through the castle, visiting ambassadors, travelling merchants with sensitive goods, accused criminals, nobles moving between chambers, priests carrying relics, treasurers transporting valuables. Escorting meant walking slowly, watching every shadow, monitoring every passerby and ensuring no one did anything foolish on either side of the procession. Training and discipline. Guardsmen weren't static statues, they trained regularly. Drills included spear formations, weapon practice, unarmed combat shield drills, quick response exercises, coordinated signalling. They also learned castle protocol, how to address nobles, when to bow, how to conduct searches respectfully, and how to handle conflict with minimal disruption. Guards faced consequences for slacking. Falling asleep on duty was one of the gravest offences, punishable by fines, demotion, extra shifts, or public embarrassment. A single moment of negligence could risk the entire castle. Every guard knew this. Their vigilance wasn't optional, it was survival. The boredom, the terror, and everything between. Most shifts were mind-numbing. Standing, watching, waiting, listening to the same courtyard sounds on repeat. But when something did happen, a fight, a fire, a frantic messenger, a suspicious figure climbing a wall, the guards were the first responders. They ran toward danger, not away from it, armed with training, courage, and the deep hope that whatever the threat was, it wasn't bigger than their combined ability to shout stop very loudly. Quiet authority. Despite their modest rank, guardsmen held enormous responsibility. They were trusted with safety, discipline, and order. Servants obeyed them, visitors respected them, trouble avoided them. They were the unsung defenders of castle life. The good news, they were essential, respected, and occasionally got the best view from the battlements. The bad news, they spent most of their lives cold, tired, and trying to look intimidating while secretly wishing someone would bring them a hot drink. If you've ever looked at a medieval castle and thought, wow, that's solid, must last forever, you owe a quiet apology to the builders and masons who spent their entire careers desperately preventing that same castle from turning into a very expensive pile of scenic rubble. These were the men who wrestled with stone, mortar, scaffolding, and the unwavering force of gravity. Without them, every tower would lean, every wall would crumble, and nobles would wake up wondering why their bedroom now had an unplanned skylight. Builders and masons formed the castle's physical backbone, literally. They repaired structural damage, strengthened fortifications, expanded buildings, added staircases, rebuilt weather-beaten sections, and performed constant maintenance that nobody appreciated until something broke dramatically. Their days were long, dangerous, and relentlessly physical. Yet their labour allowed the castle to stand firm against storms, time, enemy attacks, and the questionable decisions of nobles who insisted on adding just one more tower. Stone, their enemy, their companion, their career. Working stone wasn't glamorous. Stone didn't bend politely, it didn't cut easily, it didn't shape itself willingly, it fought back with chips, shards, dust, and weight that made every task feel like negotiating with the earth itself. Masons knew stone intimately, its strengths, weaknesses, grain, moisture, and how it responded to tools. They selected blocks from quarries, judged their quality, transported them by cart or manpower, and shaped them using chisels, hammers, mallets, picks, and wedges. Every tap of the tool required precision. Too soft and nothing happened. Too hard and the stone cracked like it had personal grievances. A master mason could shape a block so precisely that it fit seamlessly with its neighbours. Lesser masons, well, they learned quickly, or they learned painfully. Mortar, medieval super glue. Mortar was the lifeblood of construction, a mix of lime, sand, water, and sometimes animal hair or ash, stirred into a paste that bonded stone like ancient concrete. Making mortar required strength and timing. Too dry and it crumbled, too wet and it oozed everywhere like an indecisive pudding. Masons mixed mortar daily, hauling heavy troughs, climbing ladders, and smoothing it between stones with the skill of someone piping cake frosting. If the cake weighed several tons and could fall on you. Repair work. Solving problems before the wall. Falls on someone castles aged fast. Wind eroded them. Rain seeped into cracks. Frost expanded tiny gaps into giant problems. Birds nested in crevices. Roots pushed their way between stones. Previous builders sometimes cut corners. Siege attacks caused structural damage. Noble children climbed where they shouldn't. All of these resulted in walls that groaned, towers that leaned, stairs that sagged, and ceilings that looked like they needed divine intervention. Builders and masons inspected the castle constantly. They tapped stones, observed cracks, checked alignment, climbed towers to look for weak joints, and listened, literally listened, for hollow sounds that signalled trouble. Their work involved resetting loose stones, filling cracks, reinforcing supports, patching roofs, replacing worn steps, shoring up unstable walls, repairing battlements, making sure balconies didn't send nobles plummeting into the courtyard. Sometimes repairs required scaffolding, built from timber lashed together with ropes. Climbing those structures was not for the faint-hearted. One slip meant tragedy, so masons tied their tools to belts, moved carefully, and trusted the wooden frames that groaned ominously in high winds. Building new additions, the castle never stops growing. Castles weren't built all at once, Rooms expanded, towers rose, kitchens grew, great halls extended. Lords returned from travels with new architectural ideas. I saw a tower shaped like a diamond, build me one. And masons had to turn those ideas into reality. But construction projects required coordination. Quarry workers cutting stone, carters transporting materials, mortar makers mixing lime, carpenters crafting scaffolding or framing, and masons arranging every block by hand. Each stone had to be hoisted with ropes, pulleys, or brute strength, guided into place by men shouting instructions in a mixture of technical language and creative swearing. A master mason oversaw everything, sketching designs, measuring foundations, checking alignment, directing crews, and ensuring the Lord's vision didn't break physics. His role wasn't just manual labour, it was architecture, engineering, mathematics, and leadership rolled into one. Weather, the eternal workplace, rival masons worked in all conditions. Summer heat baked them. Winter froze their mortar. Rain turned scaffolding into a slippery nightmare. Wind made climbing towers feel like a test of courage. They wrapped themselves in wool, splashed water on hot tools, warmed hands by braziers, and cursed the skies loudly enough to be heard in nearby villages. They couldn't pause work for long. Delayed repairs became bigger repairs. A small crack ignored for a week turned into a large crack, which turned into a catastrophic crack that threatened to dump a chunk of rampart into the moat. Danger, always present, always respected. Working with stone was hazardous. Blocks slipped, tools fell, scaffolding swayed, dust filled lungs, hands blistered, shoulders ached, knees groaned. Many masons had scars that mapped their careers, a slice from a chisel, a bruise from a falling pebble, a dented helmet from an over-enthusiastic hammer swing, but they learned to respect danger. They handled stone gently, tools carefully, and heights cautiously. Their caution wasn't fear, it was wisdom earned through years of experience. Inside repairs, the quiet battles. While much of their work happened outside, masons were also responsible for maintaining interior stonework. Fireplaces cracked from constant heat, staircases worn from endless footsteps, arches sagging under weight columns shifting subtly over time, window frames loosening, floors settling unevenly. Inside repairs demanded finesse. Masons worked quietly in noble quarters, placing drop cloths, protecting furniture, softening hammer blows, and trying not to create too much dust, a task as realistic as trying not to splash water while swimming, the unsung foundation of castle life. Everyone relied on them, knights walking safe battlements, ladies sitting under stone arches, cooks using stone ovens, guards patrolling towers, children playing on steps, and lords sleeping in rooms whose ceilings remained obediently overhead. Yet masons rarely received the praise lavished upon soldiers or minstrels. Their work was invisible until disaster struck. But they understood the truth. Every stone they placed or repaired extended the life of the castle. They built legacies, literally. The good news? Their craftsmanship endured centuries. The bad news? They had to fight stone every single day to make that happen.